Good morning and welcome to NTIA's 2021 Spectrum Policy Symposium. For the past 4 years, NTIA has held this event to bring together the spectrum world's technical and policy-making decision makers and chart the course for our future goals. This year, our symposium will explore the theme of modernizing U.S. spectrum strategy and infrastructure. We have a terrific program planned, including keynote remarks from U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, Acting Federal Communications Commission Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, and U.S. Representative Mike Doyle, Chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. We'll also hear from Charles Cooper, who heads NTIA's Spectrum Office. Charles will be our host today and also offer an update on our most recent spectrum management activities. We have 2 panels planned this morning. One will provide perspectives on spectrum strategies for the United States, while the other will look at ways spectrum can support innovation and competitiveness. This is the 4th annual Spectrum Symposium held by NTIA, and the second to be entirely virtual. Well, we can't wait to convene in person. Again, I want to thank our audience and our participants for their flexibility this year. Sadly, we also had to cancel this year's International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technology, or ISART, due to the pandemic. This virtual conference, hosted by NTIA's Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, focuses on addressing the latest spectrum engineering challenges. However, this afternoon, we are excited to be able to offer a preview of the 2022 ISART, which will dive into how we can improve technical analyses that facilitate spectrum sharing and increase spectrum access opportunities. We'll be hearing from Michael Cotton of ITS, as well as a distinguished panel of technical experts. As you know, NTIA plays a key role in developing strategies and policies to best use our spectrum resources. We manage the use of spectrum by federal users, and as the expert executive branch agency, advise the White House on spectrum policy. NTIA also partners with the FCC and the federal agencies in implementing policy and promoting the use of spectrum for the public good. You can see the results of our partnership and our work to enable 5G. The United States is leading the way in mid-band spectrum for 5G, and we are working closely with the Commission to ensure a successful auction next month. Beyond policy changes, we also look to spur and support innovation and spectrum management tools and techniques. This innovation results in more advanced ways for all users to access spectrum, enabling sharing and helping to minimize harmful interference. In his budget, President Biden has called for continuing investments in advanced wireless research, including support for 5G and beyond. That includes support for a research initiative called the Federal Advanced Communications Test Site, or FACS. The FACS will be the only research site of its kind in the US, an open-air site to test wireless technologies and better understand radar emissions. FACS will leverage our Table Mountain radio quiet zone site in Colorado and focus initially on mid-band spectrum sharing. Our Boulder Laboratory for Spectrum Engineering Analysis and Innovation is on the cutting edge of improvements in spectrum effectiveness and efficiency. We're proud of our work so far to enable 5G, but we recognize there's more to be done, and 6G is just around the corner. One major lesson from our pandemic response is how important connectivity is for school, for healthcare, for work, and for simply keeping in touch with family and friends. Space-based industries are growing fast, including space tourism and small satellites that deliver broadband connections. Government operations are reaching higher and farther, from planned NASA missions to the moon and even Mars, to ongoing monitoring of extreme weather and changes to the climate. These often competing demands present challenges in providing access to spectrum resources, but we are on course to ensuring that sufficient spectrum will be available to achieve these national goals. NTIA will continue to work with our partners in government, industry, and the public interest community to advance the nation's goals and policies for spectrum use. It's an exciting time for our nation, where innovations such as automation and artificial intelligence will help us to chart the way toward a more advanced and efficient spectrum ecosystem. Spectrum is an enabler for U.S. ingenuity and essential services, and NTIA views its spectrum mission holistically as a continuation of its work fostering a vibrant and secure internet, connecting all Americans, and protecting public safety. I'm very much looking forward to the many great discussions today and seeing those ideas become the policy initiatives of the future. But now, I have the pleasure of introducing U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, who has provided such valuable leadership for the department this year. Madam Secretary, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 NTIA Spectrum Policy Symposium. Thank you, Evelyn, for that kind introduction and for your fabulous leadership. We learned during the pandemic that high-speed internet isn't a luxury. It's essential. It's essential to everyday life, from jobs to healthcare and education. But today, 30 million Americans don't have reliable, affordable broadband, and over 83 million aren't fully connected at home, especially those who are non-white and low income. The Biden administration is committed to building back a more equitable economy where nobody is left behind. And that means it's time to close the digital divide. That's why the Department of Commerce is making historic investments in broadband infrastructure to connect all Americans to high-speed internet. NTIA is managing 3 broadband funding programs. Combined, these programs invest $1.5 billion to get high-speed affordable internet to rural, Native, and minority communities all across the country. But if we want to reach every single American, we'll need broader investments in broadband that are long overdue. The bipartisan infrastructure deal aims to do just that by allocating $65 billion to building out our nation's broadband across the country. Through those investments, we'll also bring wireless services to all Americans. But to optimize wireless, we need our physical broadband infrastructure to work alongside our invisible spectrum infrastructure. So much of our modern world is powered by spectrum. From commercial services like 5G to aviation, space travel, and much more. Within the Commerce Department, many of NOAA's most important missions depend on spectrum. For example, our weather radars need it to warn us about serious thunderstorms, flash floods, and tornadoes. Our satellite observations require it for weather forecasting and climate projection models. And our Hurricane Hunter aircraft use it to predict when storms will intensify. Because of spectrum's strategic importance across the board, we need a national spectrum strategy that involves all major governmental stakeholders. The department has been working closely with the FCC to ensure that the wireless industry has the spectrum it needs to fully deploy 5G across the country. And because of our collaboration between federal agencies, the FCC, and industry, the U.S. is leading the world in allocating mid-band spectrum for 5G. But we need more collaboration moving forward. Next month, the FCC will begin another auction for mid-band spectrum that will help power advanced wireless services. The Department of Commerce, through NTIA, is working closely with the FCC, the Department of Defense, and the wireless industry to ensure the success of this auction. Demand for wireless technology is only going to increase in the years ahead, which is why the President has called for more investments in advanced wireless research, including support for 5G technologies. These are the investments we need to fuel innovation in wireless technology, to close the digital divide, and to keep the American economy globally competitive. We have an amazing program lined up for you today, and we're excited to get your input. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. With that, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Thank you, Secretary Raimondo, for your remarks and for your leadership as we move forward to implementing the Biden administration's vision for a whole-of-government spectrum strategy to achieve our nation's objectives for economic growth, technological innovation, and eliminating the digital divide. I'm Charles Cooper, the Associate Administrator for NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management, and it's my pleasure to host NTIA's 4th Annual Spectrum Policy Symposium. As Secretary Raimondo just stated, spectrum enables us to tackle the challenges we face in a 21st century economy that puts a premium on nimbleness. This pandemic has heightened the importance of teleworking, telemedicine, and remote schooling. It has shown us how reliant we are upon these technologies and spectrum-dependent systems that are integral on how we use them. Even more, we know that wireless networks are a key factor in our ongoing economic recovery. Today's symposium will explore the ways we can use spectrum to advance U.S. competitiveness and innovation while maintaining federal access for both current and future uses. Our discussion panels will explore these issues from a variety of perspectives. The first panel will address high-level policy, governance, and strategy, while the second panel will get a little bit more into the details, speaking to tactical level considerations of spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum access. For those of us on the East Coast, after our lunch break, NTIA's Boulder, Colorado Research Group, the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, will lead our third panel discussion. ITS's major role in this year's symposium illustrates how our work at NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management here in DC complements what ITS does in Boulder. Together, we are working to advance the nation's spectrum policies. As acting NTIA Administrator Evelyn Romani explained in her opening comments, ITS is preparing for the next ISART conference, tentatively planned for mid-next year. As many of us know, the ISART, the International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies, brings together spectrum engineering experts to push the envelope on questions concerning propagation, waveforms, and other fundamental aspects of effective spectrum usage. So this afternoon, ITS will lead several sessions discussing ways to improve and accelerate NTIA's processes for spectrum sharing and other key functions. My hope is that these discussions at all levels of the process, strategic, tactical, and technical, will help us chart a way forward. To set a stage for these panel discussions, I want to quickly review the current state of play in spectrum policy. The first thing to highlight is the multi-year effort we are undertaking with our partners in government and industry to ensure that spectrum-dependent federal capabilities are preserved and protected. Second, we have provided and will continue to provide access to spectrum for commercial wireless services, not only 5G and unlicensed technologies, but also for space-based systems. For spectrum repurposing, the current focus has been on midband. The federal government, including the FCC and NTIA, have worked hard over the past several years to make a significant portion of the 3 gigahertz band available for commercial wireless use. Because of the so-called quiet period, we will not be discussing the upcoming auction in the 3.45 to 3.55 megahertz band extensively in the spectrum. But it does represent a clear example of how rapidly the federal government can act when all stakeholders work together. And this follows last year's successful auction of licenses in the adjacent Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS band, at 3550 and 3650 megahertz. With this licensed and licensed by rural access, CBRS has demonstrated the commercial viability of a dynamic spectrum access approach. We are also working with DoD to explore how we might be able to make available the lower part of the band, the 3 gigahertz band, 3100 to 3450. So thank you so much for our Department of Defense colleagues for their proactive and constructive policy position on being willing to consider sharing the lower 3 gigahertz band that will present some challenges for repurposing. I also want to commend the FCC on all its hard work and its flexibility in our work to make the 3 gigahertz spectrum available rapidly and responsibly. I'm especially proud of the efforts by NTIA staff, who in partnership with our colleagues at the FCC and the agencies, helped to make the 3 gigahertz spectrum available. Taking stock of our collective efforts, the U.S. has made available 530 megahertz in just the 3 gigahertz band alone, including the primary non-federal bands from 3.7 to 3.98. And this doesn't even account the repurposing actions and other mid-range bands, including the unlicensed spectrum in 5 and 6 gigahertz. The mid-band repurposing efforts illustrate 2 major positive aspects for our spectrum management structure. First, the federal government can respond, and in fact has responded, to the pressing need for spectrum access to support broadband wireless services. Second, it takes cooperation and work by all partners involved, the NTIA, the FCC, and all the federal agencies to respond to commercial spectrum requirements in a timely but careful way. It is important to emphasize that we can achieve our goals for commercial spectrum access without compromising federal government's own operations, which are so important for national security, public safety, and for the science and resource management activities needed to confront climate change. Of course, the terrestrial wireless industry is not the only industry we should talk about. The U.S. has a vibrant and entrepreneurial sector for space-based services. Most recently, we have seen the continued rollout of non-geostationary satellite systems, which hold the promise of bringing more broadband network access, especially to rural areas. We also see the promise of many new industries and applications in the aeronautical and maritime services, many of them involving unmanned vehicles. Earlier this year, in recognition of the heightened activity in space, NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management released a groundbreaking report exploring the breadth of the U.S. space-based industries and charting the spectrum resources available to these systems. The report is entitled Spectrum Needs of U.S. Space-Based Operations, an inventory of current and projected uses. It's of course available on our website, and I encourage everyone when they have a moment to read it and use it as a resource. We live in an economy driven by technology and change, and that includes the tools we use to manage spectrum. At NTIA, we believe it's important to explore how improved tools and techniques can allow us to make better use of spectrum. Spectrum repurposing is not going to get any easier if we take an honest look at the relocation cost. That means we must explore other methods, including dynamic spectrum access and sharing. The classic expression of this so far is a pioneering effort to open up the 3.55 and 3.65 megahertz band for CBRS, which I mentioned earlier. NTIA is looking to build on this through exploration of what we call the incumbent informing capability concept. IIC, if it receives funding, would sharpen the focus of the incumbent's actual use of spectrum access across time and geography and provide federal agencies a common scalable platform to enable spectrum sharing. Our panels today will be discussing these issues, and I'm looking forward to hear what they think about what NTIA can and should be doing. Within NTIA itself, we are in the process of tackling IT modernization. Congress has asked us and other federal agencies to report back on what we need in order to continue to improve our spectrum management capabilities. I hope that our panelists will be talking about this too. Our goal for today's symposium is to draw upon the views and perspectives of all the stakeholders, federal and non-federal, to contribute to a vision for shepherding our nation's spectrum resources into the future. As part of that, I'd like to offer a few thoughts for us to take into account as the panel discussions unfold. The nation's spectrum policies, strategies, and plans should involve both federal and non-federal operations and equities, taking into account the full range of radio services and applications. Our actions should benefit all Americans, no matter where they live, and not only as consumers, but as taxpayers and beneficiaries of government services. We should keep in mind the goal of providing incentives to harness the power of U.S. technological capabilities and entrepreneurship. Finally, a key theme for us today is that public policy works best when it is anchored in sound science and engineering. With that, let's move on to our panel discussions. The first panel, Government and Industry Perspectives on a Future Spectrum Strategy, Challenges and Opportunities, will be monitored by OSM Senior Advisor for Spectrum, Derek Copeland. The aim of this panel is to explore and tee up the considerations, challenges, market drivers, and opportunities that should figure into the Biden administration spectrum plans and strategies going forward. The second panel, led by OSM Executive Director Scott Patrick, will focus on doing more with spectrum, supporting U.S. innovation and competitiveness in the future. And between the panels, we're excited to hear from FCC Acting Chairwoman Rosa Worcel. So after our lunch break and an important keynote speech by Congressman Mike Doyle, we'll have a third panel, moderated by Eric Nelson, Acting Director of ITS, who will delve into expediting and improving our spectrum sharing processes and investigating technical areas and data that could improve NTIA spectrum sharing feasibility analysis. So a quick important housekeeping note. I want to alert our audience that we'll be taking questions during the panel discussions through the online chat Q&A function. Now, if you're exploring this right now in the full screen mode, you'll first need to exit the full screen display on the webcast. You should then find the Q&A file to type in your question below the webcast screen. Our moderators will try to field as many of your questions as time will allow. Now, without further delay, let me turn it over to Derek Copeland to introduce the members of the first panel.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone. I know we're off to a really great start today, and I'm really excited for the panel we have with you here today for this first panel, and a real esteemed panel of subject matter experts. I'm going to go ahead and make these introductions, then we'll jump right in, and I'll do these in alphabetical order. We have Michael Calabrese. Michael is the director of the Wireless Future Project at the New America Open Technology Institute. Welcome, Michael. Next, we have Vernita Harris. Vernita is the director of Spectrum Policy and Programs Directorate, Office of the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. Next, we have Umair Javed. Umair is acting chief counsel in the office of FCC acting chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. Next, we have Jennifer Manner, senior vice president regulatory affairs for EchoStar. And finally, we have my colleague Phil Murphy, a senior advisor in the office of the assistant secretary here at NTIA in the Department of Commerce. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate that. Again, really looking forward to this panel discussion. A quick housekeeping note, as Charles sort of teased, I do have a note to share from the commission, from the FCC. They just want us to repeat today that the FCC's rule on prohibited communications is currently in effect for the upcoming auction of licenses in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band for auction 110. To ensure competitiveness, the commission's rules prohibit auction applicants from communicating with each other about bids, bidding strategies, or settlements. So auction applicants who are participating in the symposium today are reminded of their obligations under these FCC rules. So thank you. We'll go ahead and I'm going to jump right in. And I think we'll start off the first one, maybe just sort of going in that alphabetical order I introduced to jump into this. And the first question I have is a bit of a scene setter, if you will, for the panel. So think of this in a high level concepts. You know, what recommendations or thoughts should we have for key elements or principles that the Biden administration should consider as it continues to formulate and act on strategies and policies for our nation's use of spectrum? So, you know, Michael, maybe I'll turn it to you first.
Great, thanks, Derek, and thanks for having me as part of this today's very important symposium as we look ahead. So I guess I'd mention two key elements that embed a couple principles. First, I believe we need to return more explicitly to the spectrum sharing innovation that characterized the adoption of the Citizens Broadband Radio Service back in 2015. Many of us probably remember that the seminal PCAST report, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, in 2012, concluded that recommended that an essential element of federal spectrum management is that the norm should be sharing, not exclusivity. And this was echoed in President Obama's subsequent executive memorandum, and then reflected in the CBRS and its innovative three-tier sharing framework. One of the principles embedded in that was a broad concept of what I've been calling use it or share it. That is, that unused spectrum capacity should be opened for more intense use, at least on an opportunistic basis, where it can't be cleared sufficiently for licensing. So, for example, in CBRS, all private sector users protect the naval operations, but then the general authorized users, akin to unlicensed, protect the priority access licensees, but they also have the ability to use that spectrum when it's vacant. So until the licensees actually commence operations, that spectrum is not warehoused. It's not fallow, it's actually put to use. A second key element as we go forward is to continue the bipartisan effort to facilitate unlicensed sharing. Last year, the FCC adopted a historic and innovative order to open 1,200 megahertz across the entire 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed sharing. And it's, the world is following us in that, but not to the degree we did, in part because we already had experience with using dynamic spectrum databases to allow outdoor use, not just indoors. And next generation Wi-Fi, which is supported by this, Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7 in a few years, are critical to keep pace with mobile 5G, bringing 5G quality applications everywhere you have backhaul. It's needed to distribute high capacity fixed connections to the many users and dozens of devices that will be, if they aren't already, in every home and business. And this is critical as well to narrowing the digital divide because it makes connectivity more affordable. And finally, I would just note that there's another principle that's there in those two examples, CBRS and 6 gigahertz, which is it's really best to adopt a strategic framework for large blocks of spectrum rather than piecemeal reallocation, such as 100 megahertz at a time. And we have those positive examples to build on, the 1,200 megahertz that we envision for open access on unlicensed, as well as the PCAST recommendation, which you recall began by recommending a shared spectrum superhighway from 3,100 to 4,200 megahertz, and really set in motion many of the elements that Charles described, starting with CBRS, but also including the consolidation of C-band, now the auction of 3450 to 3550, and let's hope sharing the rest of the lower 3 gigahertz band as well.
Thank you, Michael. That's really fascinating, and I appreciate that. Going to turn to Vernita Harris next, and I also want to remind folks too we can make this as interactive as possible. So I'm sure you have your own thoughts, and if you want to react to what other folks said, of course you certainly feel welcome to too. So Vernita.
There you go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Derek, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I can tell you, I know that the President and his administration are committed to ensuring U.S. spectrum strategies benefit all users. For DoD, for the Department of Defense, our challenge is is really effectively conveying the necessity of access to spectrum to support our military capabilities and achieve our mission against the competing imperative of spectrum use for commerce and economic prosperity. We need more access to spectrum because for us, more access in different bands to train, to fight, and win in the current environment. It doesn't have to be a either or proposition. For us, we believe policymakers must provide flexible sharing models to allow DoD, and as Michael has stated, one of those is such as CBRS. We see great promise in working with that sharing framework. For DoD, sharing means allowing mutual use of spectrum without degradation to the mission. Sharing policies should afford current and future users sufficient regulatory protection and cannot result in loss of access to spectrum needed to perform our mission. We no longer have, and you've heard Mr. Moorfield say this on a number of occasions, we no longer have beachfront property spectrum available anymore. So with increasing demands from both the government.
Apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
My watch decided to say something. Sorry about that. With increasing demands from both the government and the private sector, spectrum is becoming more increasingly congested. And with these new technologies, tools, and policies, policies are needed to ensure U.S. competitiveness and global leadership, including dynamic spectrum sharing technologies. Looking to emerging wireless technologies, they offer the best hope for sustaining U.S. leadership and military capabilities, environment, healthcare, and education. Within DoD, we will work with the whole of government, industry, and the international community. We must work together collectively to develop new methods and technologies to allocate and share the spectrum for our symbolic goals. Thank you. Back over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Vernita. Appreciate it. Umair, I'll turn to you next. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. And thank you for having me here today. And let me just say, it's especially exciting to be here with Phil, Vernita, Jennifer, and Michael. I mean, what makes me really optimistic about our spectrum future is that when you look at everyone on this panel, representing obviously NTIA, DoD, the public interest, private industry, you really see a shared desire to make sure that the United States leads, that we lead the world when it comes to spectrum, and that the benefits of this important resource are made accessible to everyone everywhere in the country. And I think that's just a real testament to the quality of people out there that we have working on these issues. And with that said, let me, first add a +1 to everything that Michael and Vernita have pointed out. I think they're exactly right. And maybe I'll offer 3 additional ideas from the FCC perspective. First, I think as we heard Secretary Raimondo say this morning, if we've learned anything over the past few years, it's that we need a national unified approach to spectrum policy. Now, I think usually it's pretty hard to get people to agree on things when it comes to spectrum, but this seems to be an idea that everyone can get behind, and that should say something. I think most of the time it's because when we talk about having a national spectrum policy, we do so from this mindset of trying to head off maybe disagreements between stakeholders and between federal agencies. And that's certainly true. I think a whole of government approach would help avoid some of those pitfalls. But I also think we need to start thinking a little bit beyond that. And Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel has long advocated that we need a national policy because we need to treat spectrum innovation as it should be treated. And that's in strategic terms. So we need to start looking at the process of spectrum innovation in the United States and setting out a framework for the nation so that we can retain our edge as the global leader in technology-driven innovation. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think we need to develop spectrum policies that will enhance competition. And I'm really happy to see that the administration is embracing this idea early. At the FCC, one of our fundamental goals when we look at spectrum policy is making sure that there's enough spectrum available for multiple service providers as well as potential new entrants. And so in the short term, I think there are 2 things that need our focus. First, Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel has noted that we need more spectrum to support competitive mid-band 5G services in the United States. These are services that can meet both the demand for wireless data and improve service to rural, and other areas. And that means that number two, we have to tackle the fact that both prices and reserve prices for spectrum are trending upwards. And what does that mean for competition? I think we need to look at recent spectrum auctions and ask whether those prices paid are sustainable. I think history tells us that these kinds of high spectrum prices, they correlate with lower quality services and higher consumer bills. And it can mean spectrum goes unused when it could instead be benefiting society. And it also could mean enduring barriers to market entry and expansion. So I think that's something we have to start paying attention to. And third and finally, and I'll make this quick, I think we need to ensure that we have enough additional spectrum being made available to accommodate the projected increases in data traffic. And as Vernita's watch demonstrated for us, that includes the Internet of Things and wearables and speech recognition. And I think one thing is clear. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them for the past several years. And by that, I mean exactly what Michael and Vernita have pointed to, that this idea of identifying one band of spectrum and asking, can it be repurposed for a new use? Those opportunities are diminishing. For a long time, policymakers have fallen into this routine of reshuffling or refarming spectrum users like television broadcasters and trying to clear this spectrum for auction to the highest bidder. And that usually ends up being mobile network operators. But as the demand on our airwaves grow, I think this is getting harder and harder. There are fewer opportunities available to us. So I think we need to start revisiting the mechanisms that we use for licensing spectrum and exploring new paradigms. And I'll turn it back to you, Derek.
Thank you, Amir. Great responses. Really appreciate it. Jennifer, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks for inviting me today. And I'm really honored to be on this panel. As Umar said, it's a great group of folks, and this is a great topic. And it's one that I think I agree vehemently with everyone who's spoken. And I've kind of spent some time thinking through what I view are the high-level principles in spectrum management. And as I listen to my fellow panelists speak, I think we're in violent agreement, which, even though we come from all different areas, the first principle I would put out there is increasing intensive use of the spectrum resource. I think whether that's through sharing or unlicensed or any other mechanism, I think that's something we all can get behind and we have to get behind. We can't have spectrum laying fallow anymore for long periods of time. With that said, I do think there is a balance in giving people an opportunity to actually use the spectrum. So it's not something, oh, they haven't used it in a year, we should take it away. I think kind of Umar implied that as well. Something else I think is a critical principle is to protect incumbents. Because there's an incumbent use does not, and it's not, for instance, mobile wireless does not mean it's an inefficient spectrum use or it's not an important spectrum use. And we really have to take the time to look at the use of the incumbent is making of the spectrum and value that, but it can't be valued on, well, we can make more money for auctions, or necessarily always deferring that one specific use is the highest and best use of this spectrum. One that I've spent years talking about is technology neutrality. And when I talk about technology neutrality, I don't mean equality. I would never tell you that one use is equal to the other use. But what I would say is there needs to be this balance created among uses. And whether that's a government use, a commercial mobile use, a satellite use, you've got to look at it, and there has to be sufficient spectrum to meet all our important uses. And spectrum has to be allocated and assigned in that way. And it's really important that we take the time to examine that. The fourth principle is harmonization, and primarily global, but also regional harmonization. There are so many benefits we get to spectrum harmonization. We spend a lot of resources, as you know, Derek, in particular at the ITU, making sure that we do have globally harmonized spectrum. For my industry, the satellite industry, that's extremely important. It kills our business case if we can't get access to global spectrum. And even for the terrestrial industry, it's critical in terms of capturing economies of scale. So that's something I continue to think is important. And finally, increased competition. And Umar talked about competition. I would like to expand that, not just among the same service, but among different service providers, different types of technologies. I think one of the exciting things we're seeing with 5G and beyond is you're really starting to create a network of networks. You're not going to be reliant on, if this was the year 2000 and we were talking about 3G, we'd be talking about mobile wireless. But today, when we look at 5G, and you can take a look at what's happening in 3GPP in March of this year, we anticipate that release 17 is actually going to include non-terrestrial technologies. All of a sudden, you've got this great combination or complementary nature of these technologies, and they are going to compete against each other. And I think that's fantastic. We want competition. With 6G, as we get to the Internet of the Senses, I think that's even going to be a greater amount of competition. So as we start to think through spectrum policy, competition, but not just competition among the same operators, competition across operators increases. And I'll give you an example of something that's real time that's happening. I'm very active in the ITU, as you know, and it used to be you'd go to a study group 4 meeting, which is the satellite folks, and there would be satellite people. You'd go to a study group 7 meeting, which was primarily space sciences, and there'd be space science people, and study group 5 would be wireless people. Now, when you go to these meetings, there's as many of the others as there were before, and it's a few reasons. So, for instance, the satellite meetings have wireless folks, they have the space sciences folks. Part of that's because we're trying to get greater use of the spectrum, looking at sharing and other things. But the other, I do believe, is a competition issue. I think folks are really starting to recognize, putting aside space sciences, which is a different form of competition, but let's just take terrestrial, non-terrestrial, you're really starting to see competition between services. And I think that's especially true as we see the introduction of new space technologies, as Charles brought up, the NGSOs are my own company with very high speed broadband services. So Derek, those are the principles that I think about. So thank you so much.
Oh, Jennifer, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the comments so far. And Phil, I'm gonna turn to you a little bit in the, you get the privilege of being in the cleanup position, if you will. And well, I'm a baseball guy, so I know that's usually fourth. So you're fifth, but we'll call it cleanup. I'm sure you agree with a lot that's been said, and I'm sure you'll want to comment on that, and maybe even relate it or tie it to some of the administration priorities and goals in the first year here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I just want to thank all my other panelists too, and echo a lot of the things that everyone here has said already. As folks have said, good spectrum policy can drive so many of the administration's key priorities, from universal broadband deployment, leadership in 5G, national security, economic growth, scientific leadership, and looking at the impacts of climate change, which we do right here in the Department of Commerce at NOAA. And if we do it right, we can drive these opportunities in a way that enhances inclusivity and sort of opportunity for everyone, which is one of the top of mind issues for this administration. And I think the place that we need to start is good collaboration and coordination. Because when we're talking to each other and not at each other, that's where we can get things done. And I think that's where we can kind of drive policy most effectively. We need to reestablish relationships in some ways among federal and non-federal stakeholders in a way that, helps to reestablish, I think, trust. Trust in the process that we use to share, to coordinate, and to make spectrum commercially available. And I think that is one of the main objectives that we have. I spend a lot of my time on the phone talking to a mayor and other folks about how NTIA and FCC work to figure these problems out, because they're complicated and, they have a lot of impact on these core missions. And from NTIA's perspective, we want to be good stewards for this critical and limited resource on the federal side. I want to make sure that federal agencies have the spectrum or resources they need to carry out their important missions, that they've been tasked with. And we have opportunities to make spectrum available for commercial use as well. And I think to that end, we want to look at, innovative tools and technologies to help facilitate sharing. So, Charles and others have mentioned the incumbent informing capability, and the development of a common platform that could help us, I think, solve some of these challenges up front, so that, we have tools in our toolbox that can be used to attack some of these issues that federal stakeholders are facing on a regular basis. And we're not creating a bespoke solution each and every time we have a new sharing opportunity arise. I think one of the key benefits there is that, one, it reduces the lead time to develop these solutions, but two, it can help create, I think, more trust and assurance, both from federal stakeholders, but also non-federal stakeholders as they're looking at adopting more sharing and looking at some of these tools as becoming more core parts of their network or their business model. So I think we're really interested and excited about those technologies and the promise that they share. And I think as we look at the horizon, as Derek and other folks have said, we're looking at some of these bands, like the lower part of the 3 gigahertz band. And we're hopeful about, I think, what Congress has done already. I mean, I think just last week, the Energy and Commerce Committee adopted on a bipartisan basis auction language, to make that band available. And on a bipartisan basis, the Senate included auction language in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So I think we're very hopeful about the future and the opportunities here. And I think this remains a key priority for both Congress and the administration. But, I think more than anything else, what we're focused on is ensuring that, federal agencies are talking to each other and that we're working together, I think both to protect, their core missions, but also to meet the administration's overall goals of, making more spectrum available for commercial use and sort of driving some of these overarching missions such as, universal broadband access, and economic prosperity for everyone.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. And I'm thinking what I'll do now is maybe turn back to other panelists. Phil, introduce some of these thoughts of priorities for the administration on, climate, universal broadband, national security, space. And I'm wondering if folks think there are concrete ways we can tie some of our spectrum work to some of these objectives. And I think that happens now, but sort of going forward, does anyone have any thoughts or remarks on what we could do there? And open it up to the panel if you just want to, raise your hand if you're interested in responding. Jennifer.
So thank you, Derek. I think one of the things we have to think about in the goals is that every action we take with spectrum has a consequence. And I think we don't always think this through. We may be trying to achieve one goal with our spectrum allocation policy or assignment policy, but what really happens is we may undercut a different goal. And maybe I can just give an example from my world, the satellite world. So for one of the bands that we've been heavily reliant on, 27.5 to 28.35 gigahertz, the FCC made a decision years ago, back in 2017, that would become a shared band with the UMFOs, or terrestrial 5G. By losing access to that band in the United States, and there's been I think we've been fairly successful at protecting it in other parts of the world, though, there are some real consequences. It makes us harder to provide broadband service because we had access to less spectrum, and it's much more difficult to use. National security, of course, if we are unable to utilize sufficient spectrum, satellites are critical to national security, not just in the US, but globally. So every action, and I'm just using this as an action, there's certain benefits, of course, that came. We have a very important goal to get 5G out. So that was the benefit. And one of the things I think we have to look at is we can't just look at the impact on what we're trying to achieve. We also have to look at the impact on what's going to happen when we make certain spectrum decisions. And that's one of the things I think is really important to understand the good and the bad consequences of our spectrum allocation decisions. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Umair, I think maybe you wanted to comment.
Sure. Thanks. So I think, with respect to how does spectrum tie into some of the administration's priorities, the bottom line is spectrum really is key to achieving any of them. It's an essential input into our kind of next generation economy that's emerging. And I think it should go without saying that the mechanisms for licensing and using spectrum in this era where we're seeing such exponential growth of data flows, it needs to be revisited. And I think we do need to consider new paradigms of access and use that should be explored. And that's hard, obviously, as Jennifer demonstrated, there's a lot of competing interests and there's minimum opportunities. But I think a lot of times, some of the decisions we make, it's based on things like the technical propagation characteristics of spectrum below 6 gigahertz, because for so long, that's where our focus has been. I think as we move up in the spectrum chart to millimeter wave and other places, there are more opportunities for sharing. And it's obviously important to get that balance correct, but I think it's an important conversation to have, as Michael noted earlier as well, to look at opportunities for shared use of some of these spectrum resources. And if I can focus on maybe one particular administration priority that I think has really taken an interesting turn in the past couple of years, it's been this intersection between spectrum and national security. For a long time, as Vernita noted, we focused on this balance between spectrum allocation between federal and commercial users, right? The DoD needs spectrum to execute mission critical functions. Commercial providers needed to deliver new services to consumers. We know demand for both commerce and defense will continue to grow. So for a long time, the economic and national security gains from spectrum policy were almost seen as mutually exclusive. One necessarily came at the expense of the other. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that, and I don't mean that because we've developed sharing or relocation models that balance both needs. What I mean to say is that I think that we've recognized that there's another dimension entirely to this issue of spectrum policy and security. That the very decisions we make about spectrum themselves can increase or decrease our national security. And this is most evident in our supply chains, right? Our early and exclusive focus on millimeter wave frequencies and 5G had consequences for the 5G equipment market. It put us far behind in developing a market for secure 5G alternatives in the midband. And we saw other companies like Huawei and ZTE really move into that market. And we're still dealing with those consequences today. So under Chairwoman Rosenworcel, the FCC is pursuing a proactive three-pronged strategy to build a more secure, resilient, and next-generation communication supply chain. And that includes by slowing down untrusted vendors, speeding up trustworthy innovation, and then moving forward with a coordinated, multifaceted approach to all security threats. So recognizing that, infrastructure alone isn't the issue. And we see it in spectrum auctions too. There was a report by the Center for American Progress maybe 2 years ago that found that China's state-owned banks had provided billions of dollars to Huawei customers. And more recently, we've observed how some of this state-funded export financing can provide a lot of funding for certain carriers to participate in spectrum auctions in other countries. And in one recent case, we saw a Huawei customer was able to substantially outbid a new entrant in a spectrum auction and thereby denied entry to a competitor that was planning on using more secure alternative equipment for their 5G build-out. So earlier this summer, we started a rulemaking at the FCC to look at how this kind of distortionary financing to support participation in spectrum auctions could create national security risks itself. So I think this is new, this is interesting, this kind of a deeper understanding of how spectrum policy itself, I think, can intersect with security goals.
No, thank you, Amir. That is fascinating, and I certainly agree with you. And I think the FCC work here and the executive branch work, there's a lot of alignment and certainly a very interesting development. Phil, I think maybe you wanted to comment. Was I right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Amir. And I think, some of the things that, drive a lot of these conversations on the federal side is, that certain bands have unique characteristics or unique applications that either give us from the DoD perspective, a critical leg up in their national security missions, whether it's GPS or other bands. When we look at, going back to the No example, there are certain spectrum bands that have this unique capability, from a satellite perspective for passive sensors to look at, water vaporization. And so I think what we want to make sure of is that we're identifying and protecting some of those key critical uses that give us a real sort of strategic advantage when we're trying to go about accomplishing these important missions. And I think, as the sort of science continues to evolve, we're going to see those on both the federal and the non-federal side. And so, making sure that spectrum, all spectrum uses that, can be can be taken advantage of, have that opportunity. And then sort of playing off of or adding on to what Umair was saying earlier on the equipment vendor side, this is also another key priority for the administration. Under the USA Telecommunications Act, like NTI was authorized to pursue a vendor diversity strategy for 5G network equipment vendors, and we see this as being absolutely critical, in the deployment of 5G, not just here in the United States, but abroad, and, trying to open up the ecosystem of vendors in such a way that, a lot of these systems, which are end-to-end now, as Umair said, Huawei is certainly the major Chinese company that's involved here. We have 2 other companies that are based in Europe, but I think trying to unlock the U.S. domestic supply chain and apply the leadership that the United States has, both in network equipment and in software development. 2 areas where the United States has historically been, world leading in both in our manufacturing and our development, and trying to get, I think the folks that are working so hard on the network equipment side to get into the radio access network side, because we believe that that can drive competition, innovation, reduce prices, and reduce the cost of deployment ultimately, which is the way that we drive the deployment of this technology and reduce prices for consumers.
Great, thank you, Phil. I think, Michael, maybe you want to chime in?
Yes, thanks. So, 2 intersections with the administration's priorities stand out for me. One is competition, and another is digital equity. So as Umair said, we need to keep in mind that wireless connectivity is now an input to everything else in the economy. And President Biden's executive order on competition recognized that spectrum allocation and auction policy can promote competition, or it can create barriers to entry and inhibit competition, raising prices and costs. And this is true as well for wireless innovation. A robust 5G ecosystem, therefore, we believe, depends increasingly on more spectrum, not only more spectrum, but on more direct access to spectrum for smaller players, for individual enterprises, and diverse use cases. And that will need to come from more intensive spectrum sharing, unlicensed, most obviously, but also CBRS type sharing frameworks that include very small area licensing, short-term licensing, and general authorized access to shared capacity. The other intersection is fairly obvious in some respects, digital inclusion. One specific thing that we'd like to see, which Congress will need to do, is to reinvest future spectrum auction proceeds in digital equity. Auctions have raised more than $200 billion since they began in the 90s, but only once in 2012, when Congress last extended the FCC's auction authority, was any of that designated to be recycled back into the sector to promote a public interest purpose, which was the initial build-out costs for FirstNet, the interoperable public safety network. So that's a precedent I think we should build on. So, we have a proposal that the next extension of FCC auction authority, which should be next year, it expires next year, and the next pipeline bill should dedicate a substantial share of auction revenue to endowing some form of digital equity fund that will fund digital inclusion training, as well as innovative new applications in areas like education, technology, more access to people with disabilities, and so on. So I know that's a little bit out of the normal spectrum management area, but I think we need to keep that keep that in mind as well.
Thanks, Michael. I think those are really thoughtful proposals. I know Vernita, you wanted to go next. I think you're on mute.
You know, I've been on call since about 5 o'clock this morning. So, now I want to thank Amir, Jennifer, and your comments were very important. And I would like to say we actually discussed this a little bit in my group as I was preparing for the panel, and you know, we recognize that the importance of the economy, of having a strong economy, because without a strong economy, it does impact our national security. And so for us, when we think about these issues, we want to make sure that we are working with our partners, working with industry, to make sure that we are looking at those policies that are going to give us the best economic bang, as well as making sure that we're protecting our national security. From a spectrum policy perspective, we need to have a balance, though. I think we need to make sure that we're balancing our economic and as well as our national security. And so we are looking forward to continuing our partnerships with industry, FCC, and NTIA. Thanks.
Thank you, Vernita. Appreciate it. Phil.
I just wanted to echo some of Michael's comments, particularly on spectrum auction revenue. So taking off my hat over here at NTIA for a minute, you know, I spent the better part of the last decade working on the Energy and Commerce Committee on a lot of these issues related to, you know, auction revenue, auction proceeds, the whole scoring process, you know, and to be honest, I think, you know, we need to find better uses for spectrum auction proceeds and a better way to make sure that you know, that revenue doesn't just go into sort of the bottomless pit of deficit reduction, right? I think, you know, when you look at the 2012 reauthorization, you know, something like $120 billion worth of auction proceeds weren't captured by the way that, you know, that extension of auction authority was scored. And so, you know, as we're looking forward, you know, I think there's a real question as to, you know, how we sort of better take advantage of that. And I think too, I think there's a real question. I think Congress, you know, is a creature that's always thinking about appropriations and budgets. And there's a real challenge when, you know, scoring concerns are the things that are driving, you know, spectrum auction decisions and spectrum policy at the end of the day. And so, you know, the use of something that raises the most revenue may not be the best, most inclusive use of it. And so thinking through too some of the ways that the policies there and the scoring, you know, the scoring methodology is used is something that I think we should really be considering. Particularly, you know, unlicensed spectrum does not raise any revenue, and that's one of the things that makes it really difficult for you know, federal spectrum to be made available, because there's no revenue to use for relocation. So I think there's some core issues there too as well.
Thank you. Umair.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. I think that's exactly right. I think, you know, these past few spectrum proceedings and past few debates in Congress over legislation, I think really demonstrates this idea that we can do a lot more with our revenues with some proper planning on the front end. I think it's also, it would be interesting to maybe consider it from the other end of the equation as well, though. You know, from the FCC's perspective, we always appreciate kind of having maximum flexibility to think about how best to get spectrum out into the marketplace. A lot of times when you have a spectrum coming through legislation, it has instructions on how that should be done. I think what would be interesting is can we explore ways to develop spectrum pay-fors that are more than just auctions? I think that would really open up a lot of interesting possibilities and flexibility for the FCC. And just building on Vernita's comments as well, just want to say that, you know, I think this event itself, I think, demonstrates just how well I think the agencies are collaborating these days. I think, at least from my end, I want to say it's been an amazing experience working with both Phil and Vernita and others at NTIA and DoD. I think there's really strong coordination going on, and I think it's showing in a lot of the progress that's being made.
Thank you. No, I appreciate all those remarks. A lot of great ideas there, and maybe I'll sort of turn to think sort of, I think we've hinted at this, but we see the demand for spectrum growing. We've talked 5G, certainly other services space. Does anyone want to expand any more on some of these requirements in the market, or Vernita on some of the DoD and government missions, and what's driving this demand, and sort of looking forward a little bit over the horizon. What do we need to plan for here? And the follow up there is how, what are the recommendations for the U.S. government, from this planning and regulatory standpoint to better roadmap, what processes and decisions we need to take, in order to support this growth, to be ahead of the curve, or at least not behind it, and try to be maybe a little less reactive, right? I think lots of times in policy decisions we have, whether it's proceedings or bills, and we're sort of reacting to the news of the day. How can we be a little more strategic? Thanks. Does anyone want to volunteer to take it? All right, Phil.
Yeah, I guess I'll get started. I mean, the biggest challenge, right, in looking sort of over the horizon is, what's, I think on the commercial side, what's that next band that's going to be used for wireless communication, either on the licensed or unlicensed side? And, it's a moving target. At one point, I think over the last few years, people thought that was going to be millimeter, and really it was mid-band. And I think on the DoD side, we're always curious, what the new kind of cutting edge application that they're going to be looking at and investigating. And that's the real thing, is that, this is a very fast moving part of the economy that's evolving. There's a lot of investment that's going on here. So I think from NTI's perspective, the most important thing that we can do is stay in close contact and collaboration with both our federal and non-federal stakeholders, working with folks to understand what are the applications that you're developing, what are the needs and the missions that you're working to accomplish. And then I think going back again to this sort of common platform, one of the big challenges on the federal side is, how can you take these big complex systems and either move them or share with them? And so having tools and tool sets that are on the shelf, that are validated and work, and that are sort of trusted by, both commercial and federal entities, is going to be really critical, because, I think over the last few years, what we've seen is that, commercial entities aren't really willing to wait 10 or 15 years for spectrum to become available. That we need to kind of create a pipeline that is able to kind of move the ball much further, much faster. And we can't sort of depend on, some of these older solutions to accomplish that. I think we need to think more about, dynamic sharing and ways that we can more intelligently and adaptively manage and share spectrum resources. And so I think, at least from NTI's perspective, leveraging technology, leveraging things like AI and machine learning and intelligent sensors, that's the future, because that's the thing that's going to allow us to kind of more efficiently and effectively manage spectrum, and to make it available, to be honest.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Any other comments on that? Michael?
Yeah, I could, I can think of 4 things that would really move us forward quite a bit. And it's, primarily from the NTIA and federal side. So first is White House leadership. I believe we need a coherent national spectrum policy that's mediated by White House oversight. So part of that is for the White House to engage directly in guiding and mediating disputes that arise when the FCC and NTIA cannot reach a consensus on certain, bans or issues. Of course, that reaching that consensus would be greatly helped by updating, that coordination process. So last year, the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee that I that I'm on, recommended updating the memorandum of understanding for that relationship, and that would be a big start that would probably reduce friction. But there has been a lot of bumps in the road. But ultimately, we're going to need, I believe, White House to play a leadership role there. We would also benefit by updating and building on the PCAST report, which will be a decade old next year. And, we've gotten a lot of progress from that approach, but it probably needs to be updated. A second area is to accelerate the study of frequency bands with the potential of sharing large blocks of spectrum with the private sector. So I think it was mentioned earlier that NTIA is certainly doing that with and DoD with respect to 3 gigahertz, but there's other bands, the 7 gigahertz band and others that we need to move faster on. As I think Phil has mentioned, the development of an incumbent informing capability is really critical. And something like that is working already in the 60, 70, 80 gigahertz range, which is shared on a license by rule basis by the private sector, which checks through an NTIA database, gets a red light, yellow light, green light kind of system, but that can be automated and scaled much more. And finally, again, as Phil pointed out, it's a real problem that when federal agencies, find they can share spectrum, there's available capacity, that the only way to reimburse their costs is by having an auction. So we need to update the rules that govern the spectrum relocation fund again, and make it more of a revolving fund that can pay agency costs to promote spectrum efficiency, including sharing on an unlicensed basis, including bidirectional sharing, including updating certain systems.
Thank you, Michael. I'm sure some others are going to want to comment on this. I think there's been, whether it's from Congress, FCC, there's certainly been, I think, some attention on whole of government coordination and how we do that and how we make the best decisions for the United States in terms of using spectrum. And, there's a tremendous success story. I think we've heard, and, that the U.S. has led on spectrum innovation and a lot of these models, and the way we do things have been copied around the world. There are bumps in the road, but that's because it's hard, right? And the thing about it is the NTIA and the FCC don't have exactly the same mission, right, as spectrum regulators. So we have to look at things slightly differently, but we're all trying to get to the same place for sure. So I wonder if anyone else has any wants to follow up on that. Jennifer, let's go to you first.
So thank you. So I also served on the CSMAC with Michael. And just to start off, I'm not sure that I would be comfortable with the White House being the spectrum arbiter. The FCC is an independent agency. So having the White House in that role, and we spent a lot of time talking about this in the CSMAC, is something that I'm not sure how that would impact the ability for the FCC just going forward doing its job. But putting that aside, I do think that the MOU, and I was at the FCC in a commissioner's office when we did the initial MOU, and it was much needed there. I do think there are significant improvements, but it also sounds, just from listening to Phil and Umar today, and you, Derek, that what's going on there seems to be greater coordination between the agencies and DoD and others, which I think is fantastic and benefits everyone. But in terms of what we should do here, I think there's a couple of things. One is I sometimes feel like we're playing catch up. And I'm going to focus first on the international side, then go to the domestic side. First off, we finished the WRC in November 2019. There still has not been a proceeding to implement the final acts of the WRC in the US. And this is something that we have the same issue time and time again. Whenever we leave a WRC, it takes us years to implement. And we're ready by the time we take action at the WRC. I hate to say it's kind of too late. So that's something I think we have to pay attention to. But I'd say equally important is, as we're going through our own spectrum planning, we need to pay more attention to the international process and look at future agenda items that we're going to see considered. Future agenda items in our country, and I think everywhere, are sort of things that no one thinks about to the last minute, the last week of the conference, and we're all running around. But as part of the spectrum strategy that we're talking about here, I really think we have to think about what we want domestically and what we want internationally, holistically. Two areas I would like to focus on. One is flexibility. We are seeing more crossovers in terms of use, and I'll use the satellite example. Earth stations in motion. That took us years to get rules for because it's a mobile use and a fixed service allocation. And I think not getting hung up as much and trying to understand how we can move forward and provide operators more flexibility on a faster basis, as happens on the terrestrial side as well, is critical. And I would also urge that we stay away from specific uses. There's been a big push by a number of industries, IoT, utilities, and so forth, that they need dedicated spectrum. I think time and time again, we've learned that having dedicated spectrum for a particular use often leads to an inefficient use of spectrum. And so it's better to think about things in terms of broader categories that can be used. So if a business case doesn't pan out, you're not stuck with spectrum just sitting there. So those are just some thoughts, Derek, on this, but I would go back to Michael. I truly don't know, and we spent a huge amount of time at CSMAC figuring out, is there the right arbiter? But I do want to bring up one other thing. I'll be remiss, is the National Science Foundation has been doing some fantastic work. I think it's starting to set up kind of a research body, and at the end of the day, research and development, having that ability to look at things early on is important. And I can say from the satellite industry, we're still building on work that was done by NASA and the ACT system back in the 1980s. So having funding for basic research and development is something that I continue to think is really important to the growth of our ability to use spectrum more efficiently, get newer services out, and so forth. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. No, I appreciate that, and that's a great. We didn't really talk too much about research. I think we could probably spend another hour on that for sure. And good work by NSF. And I know our folks in Boulder at our Institute for Telecommunication Science are involved in a lot of stuff as well. Umair.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Derek. On the question of demand, I'll be honest. Given all the attention on spectrum and this, the prices that get paid for it all around the world, I'm always surprised by just how much uncertainty and even disagreement there is regarding how much spectrum is needed to satisfy demand, or even how much is currently in use. Now, obviously, there's these are not easy questions to answer. There's a lot of variables involved when we're kind of estimating spectrum requirements, and as Jennifer noted, you never know which business cases are going to pan out or which technologies are going to pan out. And so, but I think it is a point worth noting. When we're talking about demand, I think we need to do more than just look at amount of data traffic. I think we have to recognize that the nature of data traffic is also changing. So for a lot of next generation technologies, whether it's 5G, whether it's space-based, a lot of traffic is being driven by video. And there are other factors as well, including gaming, augmented and virtual realities, the push toward higher resolutions. All of this is going to impact, I think, the demands on spectrum. Second, in addition to just the type of data we're talking about, we're also seeing changes in the volume, right? Because of the Internet of Things. It's driving the next big acceleration in the volume of connected devices. There was a Cisco report that suggested that human beings will be using mobile phones more than they have bank accounts or even running water. I think that's really staggering. And the IoT could multiply that by several times over. And third, I think you got the type, the volume. I think we also have to look at that while network coverage is expanding in the US, much of the expansions are also focused on deepening network capacities. And technically and economically, that's a very different set of challenges than simply expanding coverage scope. And I think we have to start planning for some of that in a more intentional way as well. In terms of what do we do about that to better position ourselves? I've just been taking notes, and I think a lot of really great ideas have been put out today. We've heard that we need a unified spectrum policy. We need to fix the processes that were tested over the past few years, including revisiting that MOU between the FCC and NTIA. We heard that we need new legislative tools for repurposing spectrum that preserve flexibility. Michael pointed out that we do need to reauthorize the FCC's auction program, that expires in September of next year, and we should do that in a smarter way so we don't leave a lot of auction revenues on the table that could be used to advance public interest goals. And we need to, rebuild momentum towards spectrum sharing again. I think that's all exactly right. I think right there we've got a pretty good roadmap of where to go from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Umair. And I think Vernita.
Thank you. So I started 10 months with DoD, and I understand the challenges, but I will say that from my perspective, the agencies have been really that are in charge of looking at spectrum, whether it's FCC, NTIA, and other in the federal agencies. There has been a real concerted effort to make sure that we get back to normal, I would say, and that we have conversations and we try to resolve our issues, not in public, but in a normal fashion. So that being said, there are some challenges we have coming before us. DoD, we're looking at sharing the 3.1, the 3.45 band. That's going to be a huge lift, and it's going to be extremely important that everyone gets involved, from FCC, NTIA, DoD, as well as the private sector. We are working. Our main goal here is to make sure that we're partnering with everyone to make sure that this is a successful. We also have to. I agree that we need to start to look at other opportunities for pay-fors other than auctioning of spectrum, and that's going to take looking at ourselves, looking inward, and looking at how we are managing spectrum in the United States. I would agree with Jennifer. We can't just have allocation of frequency bands. We really need to focus on what are some changes that we can make to our regulatory frameworks, so that you're able to use spectrum across the spectrum, not just a frequency band, and start to think about spectrum. I think Umair said this as a strategic tool, because it is a strategic tool that drives economic development, and it also drives our national security. So we have to work together to start to redefine our frameworks and to make them relevant in the 21st century. Thanks.
Sorry, was on mute there. Thank you, Vernita. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes remaining here. We've had some really great questions coming in from the audience, some of which I've kind of incorporated a little bit into these questions, but have one here that's, I wouldn't call it contrarian, but kind of an interesting perspective. There was a comment that we've probably repurposed 15,000 megahertz of spectrum, counting the millimeter wave, at a pretty quick pace over the last decade. The question is, is there a any thinking that there should be a bit of a and maybe pause is the word, to sort of let it stabilize a little bit, evaluate whether the goals for doing that repurposing have been achieved. And then, how do you mitigate any maybe unforeseen consequences that came from some of these activities? So, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that one. Mayor.
Sure. Yeah. No, I don't think I'm ready to declare mission accomplished just yet. I think we do have more work to do. And I think a lot of that came out in the discussion today, just on the way the demand is growing, not just for commercial use, but for federal government use for everywhere. So I think we do have more work to do. I think we also need to look at this in kind of a purposeful way, to rather than kind of looking at an overall aggregate number of activity, kind of breaking that apart and seeing what's really been accomplished and where need still exists. I think when you look at mid-band spectrum in particular, I think we're on the right footing now, but we need to continue that progress. Chairwoman Rosenworcel was one of the first voices back in 2018 to say that the United States needed to pivot to midband. The evidence was compelling even back then. Nonetheless, I think we fell behind some other nations in doing that. The most recent Open Signal report that just came out last week, I think it shows that the countries that moved ahead fast on midband, they're now reaping the benefits of faster 5G networks. So I think we still have some work to do there. If you look at the progress that's been made in midband, the 2.5, 3.45, 3.5, 3.7, 5.9, 6 gigahertz, a lot of these were already commercial bands to begin with. And in other places, I think we have to recognize that there are stakeholders, including federal stakeholders, that still maintain active challenges to some of this activity. And so I don't think we're out of the clear just yet. I think we do have work to do and to make sure that when we say we've cleared 15,000, that's the number that sticks.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess there's maybe a little bit of thinking there is, what you're saying is not necessarily the amount of spectrum, but it's the right spectrum and the right amount. And I think what's kind of maybe factored in the question a little bit is you don't want to necessarily foreclose future opportunities by, just focusing on today. I have another question here that for those of, a lot of us have been doing this a while, this comes up every now and then, but I think particularly now that you see, so much of the, compression in systems and everyone's getting packed in and our neighbors, is it time to set more expectations and maybe even rules around receiver performance, right? And then who should set those guidelines and how should we go forward? Again, I know this is one that comes up every now and then, and is it time to do something? Anyone have any want to jump in on that one? Bill.
I'll just start off. I mean, I think, as we sort of look at different missions and different stakeholders that, GPS is a great example, right? I mean, I think altimeter is also a great example. Looking at some of these issues where, you're talking about how do critical missions operate and how do people use some of these systems, it's the end user that can really be impacted. And, I think having more forethought up front when these devices are being developed and standards are set about how they're operating and what are acceptable levels of interference, could really help, I think, downstream in dealing with issues that crop up. Because, I think for a lot of these systems, it's not that they can't be made to be more efficient. It's just that at the time that wasn't something that was a priority. And so I think, as we're talking about all sorts of other types of use cases, and other folks that need to be more spectrally efficient, I think on the receiver side, trying to ensure that, they are less susceptible to out-of-band interference is just something that is increasingly going to be necessary as we're moving forward, because it's just really problematic if you have systems that are going to be susceptible to interference that's coming hundreds of megahertz away potentially. And so I think thinking about those things, engaging with those stakeholders and trying to help them look at these problems in a more forward-looking way could be really beneficial.
Jennifer?
So thank you. I agree with Phil, and this has always been a challenge for the FCC as well, because at least when I worked at the FCC, we found there was a question on jurisdiction. But I think this is one of the important issues that we have to look at. There's another important issue that I want to bring up, though, that's very similar, and that's the issue of aggregate interference. Whether that's coming from tens of millions of terrestrial IoT devices, whether it's coming from tens of thousands of NGSO satellites and so forth. To me, this is the next receiver standard issue, and that, it hasn't really been looked at. And I think as we're starting to think through spectrum strategy for the country, much less for the world, you've really got to start to look at aggregate, because once it happens, it's going to be too late. You just can't turn everything off. So I just see it as a complement to the receiver standard issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it. I don't see any more hands from the other panelists, so I'm going to go to a wrap here. And I know we've covered a lot. I'm really excited for for us on the NTIA side to look back at this panel, and I would speculate there's probably 30 to 50 recommendations on different things that have come through this discussion. So and really all over the map too. So it's very exciting. I just open it for anyone has any parting thoughts, and or as we look forward to the next panel, which I think will focus a lot on spectrum sharing, and then this afternoon we get a little more technical with ITS as they preview ISART. And I know one of the things they want to look at is how we get even better and we get more fidelity in our things like our spectrum sharing studies. And I think that's going to be really an exciting discussion and topic. So if anyone has anything they want to make some sort of final thoughts, now's the chance. Phil?
Well, I just want to thank all of the participants, on the panel, and obviously, all of our speakers today. I think it's critical that, we be able to come together and, talk about how we're all working together on these issues and have these shared goals. Because I think it's that collaboration that enables progress. And so we're certainly really excited about the future and continuing to work through some of these really interesting and at times very thorny problems. I think with our federal stakeholders and, with good folks like Umair and Vernita and others in the federal government as we try to, take on these challenges. But it's an exciting time. And, I think this administration, really values coordination, and, it's our top priority.
Thank you. Well said, Phil. I think that's a great way to wrap. And I want to again thank each and every one of you for your participation, and I know it was informative to those listening out there. And look forward to working with everyone. And thank you again. And I will turn it back to Charles Cooper at NTIA.
Thank you, Derek, and to all the panelists. Wow, there was just a lot of information. I think some of the comments that I really heard and spoke to me was Vernita, talking about for the Department of Defense needing access to spectrum and other bands, and I can say that follows other federal agencies too. But it doesn't have to be an either or proposition, right? It can be the CBRS model. And likewise along that theme, with the general theme of doing more with the spectrum, Michael's led it off with the use it or share it. For example, in the case of CBRS, if the primary user is not using it, it would be made available to other entities to make sure that that there is availability of that spectrum. Amir's comment about the need for a unified spectrum policy, I think was spot on, and certainly also with updating the MOU that's between both of our agencies, the NTIA and FCC, and also Jennifer's comment about dedicated spectrum for specific use cases that may not be the most efficient, right? There may be other models that would need to be considered. And then with Phil, noting number one, spectrum is high on the order of Congress, with a couple of bills floating with regard to auction mechanisms for spectrum, but also the need to reestablish good coordination, not only between the federal agencies, but also with the non-federal entities. And going forward, that's going to be very critical. So a great first panel. We're going to have a second panel here in a moment, but kind of on that theme for coordination, I would like to take this time now to introduce Acting Chairwoman of the Federal Communications Commission, Jessica Rosa Russell. Working with Jessica during my tenure at the FCC, I witnessed her firsthand knowledge and leadership abilities on spectrum matters and the issues as well. Her deep expertise in spectrum comes not only from her longstanding work at the Commission, but also her time as Senior Communications Counsel in the Senate Commerce Committee under Senators Rockefeller. The Commission and the nation are fortunate to have her at the helm, and we are grateful to have her message here today as part of the symposium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to NTIA for hosting this important discussion and for inviting me to participate. This is a forum where it can be easy to get deep into the weeds about what we should do with one spectrum band or another. And I'll admit, I get excited talking about things like duplexing, propagation, or beamforming, and I bet you do too. But of course, that has its limits. So I want to start by taking a step back and offering some perspective on why today's gathering is so important for our economy and our national competitiveness. You know, if you look at the history of the wireless revolution, you see that a big reason the United States has been a global leader in mobile innovation is that we have led on spectrum policy innovation. Time and time again, we have done so many unconventional things. And more than that, we have done them first. Go back to the 1980s when the first cell phones were being introduced and the FCC was using, let's be honest, an inefficient approach to allocate commercial spectrum, with regulators deciding on an almost arbitrary basis how spectrum should be used and who those users should be. But in 1993, we moved in a dramatically different direction and reimagined how we distribute our commercial airwaves. Instead of doling out specific licenses for specific uses based sometimes just on political cues, we ushered in a new era of spectrum auctions, selling access to bidders and allowing them to use it however they choose. It's hard to imagine now, but these ideas were once mocked by experts, opposed by industry, and dismissed by policymakers. Well, nobody's mocking them now, because over the past 2 decades, the FCC has completed over 100 spectrum auctions, adding over $200 billion to the Treasury and unlocking more than $1 trillion in benefits for the American people. This model has also been adopted for spectrum auctions around the world. In fact, last year's Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded to 2 Stanford economists for their work designing the FCC and the world's first successful spectrum incentive auction. We also pioneered the use of unlicensed spectrum. Decades ago, we took a handful of underused frequencies known as garbage bands in the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz bands and decided to test a new model. Instead of dismissing these scrap airwaves as junk, we put in place a new model that set technical parameters and then did something radical. We gave the public access to these airwaves. This was edgy stuff. It was a move away from command and control spectrum policy. And this experiment was a wild success because this is the unlicensed spectrum where Wi-Fi was born. Now, this history makes clear that spectrum policy is a really big deal. We're talking Nobel Prize and hundreds of billions of dollars big. And when we get it right, we can enable dramatic, meaningful improvements for our economy and in people's lives. It also, of course, reminds us that it's not hard to get spectrum policy wrong. These policy innovations had such a dramatic impact because our previous policies allowed valuable airwaves to go underutilized. And more recently, we've seen how simply focusing on the wrong spectrum bands at the wrong time can drive up spectrum costs to unprecedented levels. Now, over the long term, this has a price because it can make it more expensive to deploy and harder to foster competition. So when it comes to spectrum policy, the stakes have never been higher. Mobile technology has already reshaped almost every facet of our lives and our economy. Now 5G is poised to unlock the potential of countless technologies that we've been talking about and slowly developing for years. The Internet of Things, telemedicine, virtual and augmented reality, precision agriculture, smart transportation networks, smart energy grids, and I could go on. And this in turn will drive the future of industry and expand the potential for machine learning and the possibilities of artificial intelligence. Now, we embrace these possibilities at the FCC, and we are focusing on 5 key principles to help guide our 5G future. First, we are freeing up more spectrum, and especially mid-band spectrum, for 5G. I believe our pivot to mid-band spectrum will be a game changer for 5G in the United States. It will foster more competition, wider coverage, and better performance. And up next is our auction next month of prime mid-band spectrum in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band. Second, we are expanding the reach of fiber facilities. Our wireless networks will only be as good as the wired connections that help make them work. I'm especially pleased that building more broadband is at the heart of the legislative discussions we are now having about infrastructure in this country. Third, we are diversifying the equipment in our networks. This is how we will return the United States to a position of strength and leadership in the market for 5G equipment. Open and interoperable equipment is the future, and we are taking action to ensure that Open RAN technology is being built here and now. Fourth, we are building security and resiliency in our supply chains. We're taking direct action to keep untrusted equipment and vendors out of our networks. We're working on a program to replace this equipment to the extent that it is present in our domestic networks today. And we are making adjustments to the FCC's equipment authorization process to help prevent insecure equipment from even reaching our shores and to encourage better security practices across the board. Fifth and finally, we are fostering American leadership in setting the technology standards of the future. I believe it is imperative that the United States government invests the resources necessary to lead in international standards development processes. Because when we do, we can lead the world. Greater participation in these efforts means more innovation at international scale and broader support for the democratizing possibilities of access to modern communications. Now here's the best part. As today's gathering demonstrates, in each of these principles, whether it is freeing spectrum, expanding broadband, diversifying networks, securing communications, or leading internationally, we have embraced the idea that no single entity can meet this challenge alone. We need a whole of government approach to get this done, and one that is open to commercial innovation and opportunity. To do this, we need to draw on the strengths in our national DNA, our hardwired belief in the creative possibilities of the future, the power of coordination, and the rule of law. This is how we turn spectrum scarcity into spectrum abundance. Now, I know many of the decisions before our agencies will be complicated, and again, I know that the stakes are high. It's why it's vital that the FCC keep an open door and an open mind and advance policies that are consistent with the facts, the law, and our most critical mission, ensuring world-leading communications reach everyone, everywhere in this country. Thank you again to NTIA for hosting this discussion. Have a great conference.
The Commission's current activities and priorities. NTIA is involved in many of these activities, and we look forward to our continued collaboration to deliver on key congressional and administration priorities. As we have said often, today and elsewhere, a solid partnership between the Commission and the federal agencies is critical for the development and application of spectrum policies, in addition to supporting each other and implementing them. Chairwoman Rosa Russell's graciousness in participating in this symposium is strong evidence in both her leadership and her willingness to work with all stakeholders. Now, let me turn it over to my Executive Director in the Office of Spectrum Management, Scott Patrick, to introduce our next panel discussion.
Thanks, Charles. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Looking forward to an exciting panel. The panel is Doing More with Spectrum, Supporting U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness in the Future. And before we get going, I am obliged to read something you've probably already heard once or twice, but I don't want to get anyone in hot water here. So regarding the upcoming 3.45 to 3.55 auction, the FCC's rule on prohibited communications is currently in effect. And to ensure competitiveness of the auction process, the Commission's rules prohibit auction applicants from communicating with each other about bids, bidding strategies, or settlements. And auction applicants who are participating in this symposium are reminded of their obligation under the FCC's rules. So I hope that keeps us out of trouble. And so let me just identify our panelists, and I want to give them a chance to speak as much as possible, so I'll keep it a little brief here. But first of all, we have Mark Gibson, Senior Director, Business Development of Spectrum Policy at CommScope. We have Will Johnson, Senior Vice President, Federal Regulatory and Legal Affairs at Verizon. We have Ruth Milkman, Partner Quadra Partners LLC. Brian Regan, Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff at Starry. And Vic Sparrow, Director of Spectrum Policy and Planning at NASA. And we're very fortunate to have such esteemed panelists consistent with the big names we've had all day today and will have for the rest of the day. So let's jump on right in, and I'm going to start off with you, Vic. And I know that like to hear about the kind of spectrum, the spectrum bands that NASA's using and what it uses its spectrum to do. And how do you see that changing in the future?
Okay, thanks, Scott, and thanks NTIA for having NASA in this panel. It was good to see some of my colleagues on the earlier panel. And if I just may, I'd just like to just say up front, some of the challenges aren't new, but it's good to hear some of the panelists already agree that it's collaboration that's the key to solving a lot of our spectrum problems, communication, and the relationships that really go a long way considering our complex processes. To your question, NASA is one of the unique spectrum users. And that's why I like the fact that we're on the panel today, because a lot of the spectrum debates are terrestrial, government versus industry. But there's a unique user that NASA has, the Civil Space Agency, that goes into a lot of science, earth science, exploration, planetary science, where we have bands identified for these unique uses, whether it's space research, earth exploration, and it requires a lot of protection, whether it be in the near Earth or the deep space regions. So these are very unique bands of spectrum, so unique that we even have a special group that we work with our space partners, the Space Frequency Coordination Group. Some of the key bands, as you already know, S-band, X-band, K-band, and some KU band, these all fit either co-band or adjacent band to a lot of the key bands that industry uses. So the planning has to take, our spectrum into account. And that's a lot of the key debates that we have in protecting our spectrum. Where are we going with NASA? A lot of it's in the public domain, our Artemis program, the putting the next astronaut, the first female, on the moon. That takes a lot of planning, from communications and navigation, coordinating with our foreign space partners, but then also putting a lot of effort into the spectrum planning that goes into the lunar region. What we've done is taken the initiative to establish a lunar spectrum manager. I think this is unprecedented. We briefed both regulators, NTIA and FCC, and now we have a group within the Space Frequency Coordination Group where we chair the Lunar Mars Spectrum Working Group. So what we're trying to do is put ourselves in a leadership position, not just for NASA, but the space community as a whole, whether it be government, foreign partners, but also to include industry. Again, we're working with FCC on that to make sure we can get to the moon and communicate and do navigation services, as well as science, in a well-coordinated fashion. So that's just some of the key points I wanted to highlight here. Again, Scott, thanks for having us on this panel. And just wanted to make the footnote that some of the history that we've had in the spectrum management community, people and names changes. Our process, our bifurcated process, is very unique, but we think it's the relationships and keeping relationships strong amongst the colleagues is what's key to doing successful spectrum management. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. I'm going to turn to Brian now. Brian, NASA is by any measurement, an incredibly successful entity. I know your company has started out, so been very successful in deploying 5G commercial services, using those high band frequencies. In some ways, we look to these to what you're doing as maybe the future that we're talking about here. Tell us, why your company is succeeding with its spectrum use, and what do you think needs to happen to make Starry even more successful?
Well, thank you, Scott. Appreciate the opportunity to participate on the panel today. Starry started over 5 years ago now with the goal of trying to improve last mile connectivity. So really focused on improving access to broadband and digital equity as we went about trying to build a new broadband network from scratch. The founders of the company realized very quickly the only way to do this at scale and raising venture capital is to use a different kind of technology. I think everyone knows that fiber is an amazing technology, but it's very difficult to build fiber networks quickly. It's difficult to finance them. It's difficult for a startup to begin building a network using just fiber. The team had a background in RF and very quickly realized that the system had to be wireless so that you can change the economic model, so that the CapEx required to build a network was largely related to attaching subscribers, not to building out the coverage network. And two, you needed really high channel bandwidth in order to do gigabit capacity using fixed wireless links. This was back in 2015, sort of on the early stages of the 5G technology development path, and the technology didn't really exist at the time. So there were a couple of really important things that happened. One was the commission, and working with NTIA and DoD, set up the lower 37 gigahertz band as a licensed shared band. And that was really an important catalyst for our ability to raise money, to design equipment, and build a tech ecosystem that we could use to then deploy and test a network using licensed millimeter wave spectrum. And licensed millimeter wave spectrum is really an important part of this. If you're trying to do really high quality, robust gigabit broadband, millimeter wave is important for high channel bandwidth, but license is really important because it allows you to operate at high power to overcome some of the physical difficulties that exist with millimeter wave spectrum, which have sort of, it's a two-sided, two-edged sword there, right? Some of the benefits of millimeter wave propagation is it allows you to share it, which we can talk more about later, but it also has some constraints in terms of the range and reliability of the spectrum. So licensed spectrum is really critical to doing that. And to the commission and NTIA and DoD's credit, in 2016 established this licensed coordinated shared band in the lower 37 gigahertz band. And then, the next administration reaffirmed that decision a couple of times. And that was really a critical catalyst to our ability to create a new equipment ecosystem. So because sort of at the time the technology didn't really exist, our tech stack was born really out of necessity. So we created a new kind of technology that relies on 802.11 baseband radios that we upconvert into millimeter wave technology or millimeter wave bands, and then add our own beamforming and beam steering on top of it. And today, the result of that is that we've created a new domestic equipment ecosystem that's robust, that's secure, and that's homegrown effectively. And we're one of the only providers in the world today that has two-way fixed and millimeter wave spectrum, which is really, really critical. We think the near-term opportunities for the commission to wrap up the rules in coordination with NTIA and DoD to make the lower 37 gigahertz band available on a shared basis going forward, and then really use whatever techniques are there and that can evolve over time to continue to look at other opportunities in millimeter wave, which we can talk more about. But really, we see this as a chance for the U.S. to continue its leadership role to facilitate additional kinds of uses in millimeter wave for 5G and beyond.
Brian, just real quick, let me ask. So we hear about the high band and how much capacity that's providing. Do you see that constraining your particular operations at any point in the near future or the far as well?
No, I mean, high band is really critical for gigabit. You can do really high quality last mile connections with high band spectrum and utilizing the wide channel bandwidths that come with it. I think the opportunity to continue to have access to it, a lot of the spectrum the commission's identified for commercial use in millimeter wave has been auctioned. There's a small sliver that's still sort of left aside for shared use. I think the opportunity is to continue to extend that and expand that to find additional bands that could be useful in millimeter wave for licensed shared access for non-traditional kinds of uses.
Thank you, Brian. Let's move on to Ruth Milkman. Ruth, here, you're hearing our panel. We're focused on doing more with spectrum, and you've recently co-authored a big think paper on spectrum sharing and noting that to all of us that spectrum sharing has been happening in one way or the other for actually a while, even since radio. And the paper outlines some general ideas for progress and covers lessons learned. What are those lessons that we've learned from the past on that kind of sharing or sharing in general, and what could that mean for future spectrum use?
Thanks, Scott. As you mentioned, John Leibovitz and I recently published a paper. It's called Taking Stock of Spectrum Sharing. available on the SSRN network. And it's about spectrum sharing policy, and it provides examples of different kinds of sharing, and then it identifies 2 bands for focus in the future, both of which have been discussed already today, the 3 gigahertz band and the lower 37 gigahertz band that Brian was just focusing on. We're not focused on sharing for the sake of sharing, but rather sharing as a means to an end, which is making more spectrum available in an efficient way. I've been involved in a lot of proceedings in which we cleared the bands, we reallocated them for exclusive use or repurposed them. And that's great if you can do it, but those opportunities are likely to be fewer and farther between in the future, as both Charles Cooper and Umair noted. It's just, there's less of it out there. So that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the speakers today have been focused on the sharing opportunity. When federal systems are involved, and you're talking about potentially relocating or clearing federal bands or federal systems out of bands, it's important to recognize what the real costs of relocation are. It's not just the dollars involved, but it's the risk when you're talking about changes to a system that supports national security. And we also thought it would be useful to consider the opportunities that can be created by sharing. For example, if you have low barriers to spectrum access, that can yield innovation and competition and uses by non-traditional companies. And that's what we're seeing right now in the CBRS band. In particular, the CBRS band is emerging as the home in the US for private 5G industrial networks that will enable applications like smart manufacturing, smart agriculture, that will help drive industrial progress, job growth, and US competitiveness in the coming years. And that brings me to the 3 gigahertz band, 3.1 to 4 gigahertz, or I suppose technically 3.98, and the possibility of reorganizing this band to group higher power and lower power uses. So right now, starting at the top of the band, you have 3.7 to 3.98, which is high power exclusive use. Below that, the CBRS band, 3.55 to 3.7, lower power, shared use, tiered sharing. Below that, 3.45 to 3.55, which is the band that's about to be auctioned, again for exclusive high power use. And then from 3.1 to 3.45, a federal band with an unknown future, but a lot of interest for both exclusive use and a CBRS-like sharing approach. So you've got kind of a patchwork at the moment and a lot of borders between, unlike services in the sense that you have high power next to low power and then another border of low power to high power. So assuming that there's some additional CBRS-like spectrum below 3.45, our paper suggests that policymakers look at potentially reorganizing the band so that you have high power exclusive use at the top and a CBRS, any CBRS-like lower powered spectrum below that. And then there's only one border, and it also potentially improves the opportunities for sharing with the federal incumbent systems in the band at the bottom, that are at the bottom of the band. The other band that we discuss in the paper is the one that Brian mentioned, which is the lower 37 gigahertz band, 37.0 to 37.6. That's 600 megahertz of spectrum designated for sharing between federal government and commercial uses. And the technical characteristics, as Brian said, mean that it should be possible to have multiple users in the same frequencies, the same geography, and the low amount of incumbent use provides a greenfield opportunity to build in true bidirectional sharing from the very beginning, which is an opportunity we really haven't seen before. And this could be a simple automated system that's based on sharing standards and ideally works for everyone, federal and commercial users. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ruth. That is, wow, those were great points and said very eloquently, and I really a terrific intro to our next guest, Mark Gibson. Mark Ruth had a lot of things to say about CBRS. We're of course talking here about on our panel here about competitiveness in our country. I'd like to hear where you think CBRS fits in that story. And here's a little bit of a softball, I admit. Do you see CBRS working, and how do you see it evolving, and especially in light of what Ruth had to say of this opportunity here of these connected bands in the three, or contiguous, I should say, in 3 gigahertz?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Those are really fascinating and timely questions. I'd like to start again by just thanking for the opportunity to speak today. It's always a pleasure to speak, on NTIA panels. They're very substantive, and it's fun to share thoughts with leading experts. And I can't talk about CBRS without a shout out to you guys, basically Office of Spectrum Engineering or Spectrum Management and the Spectrum Engineering and Analysis Division, Ed Dressel and his team, for all the work you guys have done to make CBRS a reality. We could not have done it without your work, tirelessly and really innovative. Some of the work that's come out of your shop is really fascinating and excellent. And I'm not just trying to butter up the moderator. It's really made the difference for us to be able to deploy CBRS in this country. And I think when you talk about competitiveness, we need to talk about the role, I think, of the regulators. Both the NTIA and the FCC got things going and stepped out of the way and let industry go with it. I think you heard Michael speak on the previous panel, Michael Calabrese, that CBRS was sort of born out of PCAST, which is essentially was a federal government idea from the President's Council and Advisors of Science and Technology. Building on the concept of tiered sharing, which is not new. I mean, it's been out there for a while. In fact, one of the first things, I'm not sure if Ruth mentioned this in their paper, I've only perused it, but the frequency agile sharing technology that was deployed in PCS back in the 90s was one of the first iterations of spectrum sharing, very much like SAS, for example, where a base station had data on local microwave systems, and it sensed where they were operating and configured their base stations to deploy to avoid it. And that goes back, like I said, in the 90s. United States centric opportunities that led to TV white space, which was born in the United States but has been used worldwide. And now we come to SAS and the CBRS, which really has been deployed to obviate the need to relocate radar systems. And so in federal radar systems, board aircraft carriers that are very difficult to move. So, and the other thing too is it's this 3-tiered sharing concept, again, that was born out of the PCAST, which also allows for interoperation between a licensed share, a tier, and then in the unlicensed or pseudo-unlicensed tier. And so again, that allows for operation for a layer that pays money at Spectrum, buys Spectrum, and for a layer that's pseudo-unlicensed that operates, around the previous 2 tiers. And all of that is affected by a Spectrum access system. So again, in terms of just competitiveness and what it does for the United States, it allows us to be able to put Spectrum to immediate use without having to wait for relocation, where relocation may be indicated or not, and then we can get a revenue stream going right away, both in terms of the commercial use and auction opportunities. So there's many ways we could talk about sort of our exceptionalism in sort of spectrum sharing. I think we lead the world in spectrum sharing, and other national regulatory associations or NRAs are looking at this as well, both in this band and in other bands I'll talk about in a second. In terms of success, the CBRS, I'd say, has been successful. In 2 years, or close to 2 years, it'll be 2 years next January, we have absolutely had no reports of interference from any incumbents, which includes the DoD, as well as the satellite operators, and also the grandfather wireless broadband guys who are being shifted out. So one might argue that we may be overprotecting, but at least there has been no reports of harmful interference whatsoever. So for all intents and purposes, we believe the SAS concept is working, and it has led to deployment of over 170,000 base stations so far. And that has been somewhat depressed by COVID. We were hopeful that by this time we'd have a lot more in-building deployments by now, given that this whole concept leads itself to in-building as well as outdoor. But with COVID, there's not a lot of people in buildings, or at least in their homes. And so we'll see that number pick up over the course of the next several years. But it also has supported numerous use cases in areas that maybe heretofore might not have seen the ability to use the spectrum on their own, including education, healthcare, transportation, rural broadband, private networks, a host of use cases that, the CBRS band has really given spectrum to people that can put it to use right away. And again, that also helps their competitiveness. And it may not work in every band, but it's worked really well in the 3.5 gig band. The ESC is part of this whole spectrum sharing framework, and while the ESC is a concept, I have to say we would like to see the ESC replaced with something that you and I think I heard Charles talk about the IIC, or their incumbent informing capability. We're really eager to see that get takeoff, and really we think that would be a more efficient way to share. But nonetheless, the ESC is working, and again, it's protected the Navy radars and the ground-based radars without any issues. In terms of evolution, possibly to next concepts, the SAS we think has led to the automated frequency coordination concept that's being deployed in the 6 gig band. That's what the chairwoman was referring to allow the higher powered 4-watt devices to be deployed throughout the band in the 2 areas where they're allowed among the entire 1200 megahertz. And so the commission just last week, or maybe the week before last, issued a public notice opening up the window for AFC applications or proposals. And so we're hopeful that will also, give rise to a really robust ecosystem for sharing in that band, which should be very similar to sharing in other bands with a centralized database centric type system. In terms of other bands, Ruth referred to the 345 gig band and below. The band at 3100 to 345 gig band, we're eager to see, how some sort of a dynamic sharing might work in that band. Centralized dynamic SAS-like sharing. So as that band matures in terms of its thinking and regulatory processes, we think that could work. And then finally, Vic mentioned a lot of the work going on in the passive services, not just by NASA, but others. And the SAS, protects the passive services in the 345 gig band. We've got large protection zones around areas like Green Bank and others. And we're members of the Wireless Innovation Forum. The Wireless Innovation Forum has just kicked off some study of passive and active sharing services, or passive sharing and passive and active services. So we're hopeful that we can drive a lot more innovation around how we can share with some of the passive services. So that's a quick rundown of how SAS CBRS is working.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that comprehensive answer, and thanks for the flattery. That's awesome to hear that that NTIA and I don't think you directly mentioned the FCC, but I know when Ruth was chief there, that a lot of the laboring ore was done there, and by Brian as well. We've got
Brian and John
got the mind trust here on this panel, so that's great. I want to turn to our last panelist, and before I do, I just want to mention so that folks have time to think. There will be time for questions and answers, questions from the audience at the end. So please feel free to funnel those in, as was done in the prior panel, and we'll have time to hopefully have time to look at those at the towards the end. But now next Will, and so much goes without saying, and I think maybe we should go ahead and make a point of saying it here. All of this demand, Will, for spectrum is really the fault of folks like Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile. They've created a reliable, desirable product that people love. And what is going on that would, will the spectrum demand ever diminish? And what kind of use cases that do you see in the future that will keep this demand accelerating?
Well, first, Scott, thanks for having me today, and thank you for NTIA for convening us. It's an honor to be with you and the other panelists. And following Mark's lead, I'll say you look quite handsome today. So, so I'm not sure about it all being our fault. That may be going a bit too far, but you're right that our industry has been an incredible success story, and that spectrum is really the lifeblood of our industry. So that's certainly true. With each new generation of wireless technology, the technology becomes more central to people's lives and to the U.S. economy. I think we all know from the last 10 years or so what 4G did for us, bringing us the app economy, bringing us smartphones, all these things that not so long ago didn't exist, but that really have been hugely impactful for people and for the economy. And fortunately, a lot of that, I think the US gets credit for smart spectrum policies in the past that really for 4G made the US kind of the epicenter of a lot of that development work. So that's great. When it comes to 5G, we're still in the very early innings. It's going to be even more revolutionary, I think. So 5G isn't just like faster downloads to your phone, but it's really got a whole range of technical currencies. So things like speed, latency, reliability, energy efficiency, scalability. So all these things that really will enable a whole variety of new consumer and business use cases and applications that really the technology just didn't support before. Granted, a lot of those we don't know what they are yet, but they are coming. I feel very confident of that. In terms of the impact of that, of what the stakes really are here in terms of the 5G economy, one recent study estimated that the 5G economy will contribute $1.5 trillion to the U.S. economy over the next 10 years, and that the wireless-related jobs will double over that time. So that's really talking 4.5 million new jobs. So again, really high stakes here to get this right. To help build that future, companies like Verizon are making historic investments in our country's digital infrastructure. I know we're all spending a lot of time thinking and talking about the infrastructure bill and the billions of dollars that may make available sometime this year, or if Congress gets that passed for broadband. But let's not forget that earlier this year, Verizon just by itself invested $52.9 billion to obtain access to the C-band spectrum. And then we followed that very quickly with an announcement that we were adding and committing $10 billion in capital just to build out the C-band. And that's, by any measure, I think, a generational investment in our 5G network. And all that money is on top of the 17 to 18 billion we've been spending year after year on capital. So really huge investments in our nation's digital infrastructure here in our 5G networks. In addition to the C-band and mid-band, we have also been investing heavily over the last several years now in millimeter wave. I know Brian already touched on what they're doing with millimeter wave, but just want to emphasize that's a really crucial differentiator in our view for our 5G network and something we're very much committed to. By the end of this year, we're going to have already 30,000 sites on the air with supporting millimeter wave. Just last week, I was walking by one on 6th Street and, as I want to do because I'm a nerd, broke out my phone, did a speed test, and was getting over 2 gigabits of speed there in downtown DC. So super exciting stuff, what that's going to enable. And we really think it's kind of the combination of the C-band, in our case, mid-band and millimeter wave, that really helps you have sort of the true power, the transformational possibility of 5G networks. So we couldn't be more excited. Since I am the only one for our industry on the panel, I will acknowledge that other people in our industry are also spending a lot of money on 5G. I think the CTI estimate is going to be like $275 billion that the carriers as a whole are likely to spend on their 5G networks over the coming years. So really massive amounts of investment in this infrastructure. So back to your question about the demand for spectrum and will it ever diminish? I guess I'd say don't count on it. As a telecom guy who has an 8-year-old that one day needs to go to college, I hope it doesn't diminish anytime soon. One recent projection suggested that the wireless industry is going to face 500% plus growth in traffic by 2026 over the next 5 years. And keep in mind, that's against a backdrop where traffic already increased 100-fold since 2010. So that level of growth is really pretty mind-blowing. And I guess that's why our network engineers don't get a lot of sleep, to not only keep pace with the growth, but to continue to maintain the quality of service and the reliability and ever-increasing reliability that people really expect of us. So it's a lot of work, a lot of investment to make that happen. In terms of use cases for 5G, I guess I'll break it down between sort of consumer and more industrial or business use cases. On the consumer side, there's a lot of early stage development still. People are excited about what's going to be possible with VR and AR and gaming and all those sorts of things. The one use case I wanted to focus on, though, that I'm most excited about is for 5G home service, so our fixed wireless access offering enabled by these same 5G networks. So we announced that our 5G home will be available to 50 million homes by the end of 2025. So that's just, again, 50 million, huge numbers here. in a very short number of years. That service is a very robust broadband service. I know there's a lot of talk about fiber, but 5G home, it's very robust. It'll meet consumers' current and future demands. And it does bring, in many places, in most places, strong competition to wireline offerings like cable, where in some cases there might not be as much competition today. It does that while also providing, and I think one of the earlier panelists mentioned this, that the wireless opportunities here can, in many cases, be deployed a lot more quickly and cost effectively than fiber. So it really has real potential to make a difference when you're looking at ways to quickly make progress on closing the digital divide. On the business and government side, again, I think there's tons of exciting use cases there. It's probably a bigger game changer in that area than it is even for the consumers. So we're expecting, the 5G will be integral to things like telemedicine, smart factories, and transportation, green energy, a whole range of things. So very exciting, and particularly when you start layering onto these networks the new capabilities like mobile edge computing, which really will just unlock, untold innovation in this area to really address all sorts of societal needs. So very, very exciting. To keep up with that level of traffic, I think back to your original question, no surprise, I think that we are going to need additional spectrum. That's just, again, going to continue to be the lifeblood of our industry. So don't expect us to stop talking about spectrum pipeline anytime soon. But I will note that at the same time, we're very aware of the need to use spectrum efficiently. I think we're one of the most efficient users of spectrum in the world. And things like the eye-popping prices of spectrum auctions and the challenges of getting new spectrum to market make us have to be efficient here. So that's something that we are doing everything we can and focusing very heavily on. So with our 5G nationwide service, for example, that we launched last year, right out of the gate, we were using dynamic spectrum sharing to make sure that of the spectrum we already have, that the same bands can be sort of used in real time for either 4G or 5G, depending on demand that's happening there. We also are doing other things like virtualization, network slicing. So we're basically trying to do everything we can to squeeze every ounce out of the spectrum that we have access to today. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for that answer and description of the exciting things going on at Verizon. Let me turn to Vic Sparrow at NASA. Vic, it sounds like Will wants to make NASA a customer. He's got lots of 5G ideas and plans, and you're hearing today a lot about a lot of demand. Can you, we haven't really talked about interference. If we're doing more with spectrum, that of course interference is going to be on the other side of that. Do you envision a future where this becomes an even greater problem, and especially, and I'm stealing a bit from the audience here, pardon me, but regarding your passive sensors, that they can be particularly vulnerable to interference. Is this going to be a bigger problem, and what should policymakers be thinking about from your perspective, especially even from the perspective of the federal government?
So Scott, let's see, I'm not on mute. This is a multifaceted question here. Let me see if I can keep it short. So first, let me start with the positive. I really don't look at the industry as a problem. I look at them as a solution, as a partner. As you know, we have multiple interests, U.S. interests, and it goes from science to economics to the healthy commercial industry. I think we had a few hiccups the last cycle, but it comes down to, I think, communication, what our needs are, what our industry needs are, and if there's technical solutions, then yes, those should be solved with the technical experts, not elevated to certain levels where we probably get less help than needed. I think we'll benefit from that this cycle. And I offer to Will and his other industry broadband partners, NASA's doors are open. We have multiple doors that NASA connects to with our not only federal partners, but our foreign partners, for us to educate each other on how we use the spectrum. It's very complex, and I think the communication on the technical side could take us a long way before we elevate it. And then the rest of the decisions that have to be resolved on a not only a senior domestic process, but then the international process as well. But the positive side, we're already looking at 5G in space. We're working with 3GPP. We work with Nokia looking at 5G on the lunar surface. So traditionally, we talk about sharing in-band or sharing adjacent band with different systems. I think this is sharing in terms of being a user on your technologies. We can take your technology to the lunar region and beyond and not reinvent the wheel. So I think this is something that will grow. I think it solves the issue of interference, but because it won't be your systems versus our systems where we operate. We'll collectively be operating or utilizing the same system. So we'll develop those standards and emission characteristics together. So just that's with where we're going with broadband. The other part of that, I think we're going to have a challenge in terms of actors in the space region and where the jurisdiction begins and where it ends, lunar region and beyond. We've been working with the regulators to kind of figure that out. We can pre-coordinate and try to prevent interference to the maximum extent possible, but if operational interference, happens in the space regions, then yeah, we got some homework to do with some of our international regulators and how to deal with that. I think the FCC and others are going to be challenged with the the low Earth orbiting spacecraft that are out there in terms of collision avoidance. We have an adjacent area within NASA that looks and are concerned about space debris. So that's going to be a challenge. So I think with the passive systems, there are technologies. We're working with NSF and others within NASA. Are there technologies to look at and address adjacent band active interference? Because we know once you lose the data from your resonant frequency emissions, you don't recover those. But we are wanting to collectively have that conversation with our active users. And then at the end, at software-defined radios, cognitive radios, I think those would be big game changes in terms of how we utilize spectrum, how we address interference, multi-band systems, waveform, software definable, and then just cognitive sensing environments and where opportunities that we can go. So yeah, that's a very, very complex question. It's a technical, a regulatory, a policy piece to this, but NASA is fully ingrained in trying to solve that, and we have a kind of a draft spectrum strategy. Some of the earlier panel mentioned, we need a U.S. strategy. We kind of have holding ours as a draft, and one of the key tenets of our NASA spectrum strategy is partnerships. And I think partnerships is a key in kind of moving forward in some of these areas. So, kind of took a little longer, but thank you for the question. Yep.
Excellent. No, not long at all. We love to hear from you, Vic. So let me turn to Brian, and Brian, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the the high band frequencies. And the good news here is that there's a lot more of it. And we heard Ruth refer to the possibility of greenfield on a kind of an unprecedented scale. I hate to use the word filling a vacuum, but the trajectory of at least American innovation is that we're going to find ways to use these frequencies. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do policymakers need to treat high band frequencies any differently than that's happened in the past? And what should the U.S. be doing to lead the way in high band, or at least from a policy perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate the question. High band spectrum, I think, as we've talked about, is a really interesting opportunity for sharing because it has physical characteristics that make it more shareable in time, frequency, geography, and even elevation than lower bands. Take, for example, the fact that many millimeter wave bands are shared today between terrestrial and satellite systems, whereas in lower bands, that's a binary choice. I want to make 3 points about this. One, I think, given those physical characteristics, there is a really big opportunity to take advantage of them. And specifically, directionality and attenuation through physical obstacles are the two physical attributes of millimeter wave that allow greater intensity of use than you would find in lower bands. And I think most importantly, or interestingly in the near term, is the bidirectional sharing that Ruth had mentioned between federal and non-federal users. In certain bands, lower 37 gigahertz band, and I'm sure we can find others in the future, there's a chance to establish a sharing regime between federal and non-federal where both sides are sharing on equal footing, where you can have technical rules that are the same, where you can have use cases that might be similar, and you can establish a sharing regime that allows both federal and non-federal users to access and leverage the band for their use cases on a co-equal, co-primary shared basis. And I think that's really interesting and important. And the second piece, I think that you can take advantage of the propagation characteristics of millimeter wave for indoor-outdoor sharing. So unlike lower bands, because millimeter wave really doesn't travel through physical obstacles, you can have higher power uses on both sides of a wall and have those two things coexist at the same time. And I think that's a real interesting opportunity to continue to explore. You know, we're still in the early stages of really characterizing millimeter wave propagation across network types. We've been doing a ton of work on it. I know Will and Verizon and the mobile industry writ large has been spending a ton of time deploying these systems and characterizing. But the reality is we're still relatively early stages. And I think there's a near-term opportunity to, as Ruth said, leverage existing sharing techniques in new ways to help facilitate shared access in millimeter wave. So things like leveraging existing point-to-point coordination techniques and layering in geographic aspects that exist in other sharing regimes to try to facilitate both mobile and fixed shared use in millimeter wave bands, and then evolving those over time as the technology continues to develop and evolve, and as the industry knowledge, both in terms of commercial and federal uses and technologies evolves, an opportunity to continue to evolve the sharing techniques and methodologies. And then lastly, I think, you know, while sharing in high band is really important now and in the future, it really shouldn't be at the exclusion of sharing in lower spectrum. I think, Scott, as you said at the outset, there's a lot of millimeter wave spectrum that's already been made available. There's a lot more above 90 gigahertz. The commission's kicked off proceedings to explore those. But the same is not true in lower band. Lower band is more scarce. It is more intensely used, and the need is more acute for finding sharing techniques in lower bands. And the second piece of that is the techniques and tools and strategies might be different. So you might have tools and techniques and strategies that work in millimeter wave that may not work in lower bands, and the same is true for lower bands to higher bands, which is not to say that neither or either is more important than the other. Just to say that they do have unique characteristics that I think ultimately lead to the need to solve, both from a policy perspective and from a technology perspective, the sharing regimes for both. The good news is I think the near-term need is likely higher in lower bands, and lower band sharing I think is much more evolved at this point than it is in higher band, in part because the propagation is better known, the system characteristics are better known, and CBRS I think as Mark described has been a success. There's lots of new use cases coming in, the SAS works, the ESC works. You have tools, technologies, and policies in place that can be utilized to expand shared access and additional bands below 6 gigahertz, which I think is a really interesting and exciting opportunity. I think the last part of your question, you know, I'm a little biased, but I think the US did a good job out of the gate in making high band spectrum available back in 2016. I think we're really the first to make large quantities of millimeter wave available for commercial use, flexible commercial use. And while I think it's still pretty early stages in commercializing it, the results have been pretty positive. Like the mobile industry has deployed a substantial amount of millimeter wave, and particularly Verizon, I think, leading the way in that regard. We've been able to develop our own equipment ecosystem and deploy a competitive network to provide service to tens of thousands of customers across the country, and intend to expand that dramatically over the next few years. But you know, mobility isn't the only use case, and I think there's an opportunity to think about the fact that we've sort of solved millimeter wave for mobile use cases for sort of commercial mobile industry. There's a little bit more to do there, but there's a multiplying effect that you can add on top of the economic and technological innovation that's going to come from the mobile industry by figuring out ways to leverage the spectrum for other kinds of uses that may exist today. So things like Industry 4.0 or industrial 5G and 6G, but things that we really haven't thought about, and making that space available for new and innovative uses to come to fruition, I think is really important. And I think Starry is just one part of a success story and how that can work and how that can happen, where given the availability of spectrum that is high quality, that is shared, that has low barriers to access, you can really add a multiplying effect from an economic and technological perspective. And I think that could be an area that the Commission, NTIA, DoD, and other federal stakeholders could look at in the near term.
Tremendous. That's great to hear, Brian. I'm going to turn to Ruth now. Ruth, Brian has a pretty optimistic view of the future, and that's good news. But we also heard, as you said in your first question, noting that these opportunities for repurposing spectrum are going to get fewer and more difficult. So it sounds like these are challenges, but given Brian's optimism, referring in some part to spectrum sharing, and I know your paper dealt with this, your recent paper, your co-authored paper recently dealt with this, is that, well, there are a lot of flavors of spectrum sharing. Can you guide us a little bit of what you see as the flavors, if you will, that are working, and which ones you see promising and maybe policymakers should focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer that question, I just you're talking about different flavors of sharing. And one of the reasons that I think sharing is so useful is that there are also different flavors of use. So we have this tendency not to think about all the varying uses that the federal government has, although they've been mentioned today. But in addition to all the active uses, there are the passive uses that Vic mentioned. Same thing's true on the commercial side. And this is something that was really brought home to me when I was in the Wireless Bureau at the FCC. There are just, the focus is often on the large national mobile carriers because it's a lot of money and everybody's got at least one device and maybe multiple devices, and they are fantastic and an engine of US growth. But there are also other users of the spectrum, like new entrants like Starry, and a mix of carriers, smaller carriers, cable companies getting into the wireless business, new kinds of service providers, but also self-provisioned industrial networks now. And I think it's important. One of the benefits as we think about sharing is that it enables all these different kinds of uses in a way that perhaps focused only on exclusive use. And again, I want to say there is a place for exclusive use spectrum. But one of the things that sharing enables is the capability of having a lot of different kinds of networks, uses, players, both on the government and commercial side. Okay, so having said that, what are the types of sharing that we looked at? So early on, we had, when John and I, Leibovitz and I were working on this paper, we had a conversation in which people suggested, as I think Mark Gibson has also suggested, that we have some kind of standardized or a flavor of sharing that can be replicated, and I think that's really important. But one of the things we realized as we were working on the paper is that, and Mark's point, I think, was you build the system, you get the trust and the experience with it that enables it to then be used in other bands. I think the CBRS-like sharing approach with perhaps some modifications like the substitution of the IIC for the ESC is exactly one of those kinds of systems. But one of the things we realized as we were working on the paper is there are actually a number of different sharing techniques out there that have been used, some more successfully than others, but there's the continued coordination type sharing which was used in AWS3 and now can be used in other bands. And then there's the sort of set of automated sharing techniques that can be used when you have systems in a band that need to be protected, like in the TV white spaces band, or in 6 gigahertz, and you have some kind of an automated frequency control system. And those are two that I think are quite useful. But there are others we didn't mention in the paper, but there's the 70, 80, 90 approach to coordinated sharing. And that's yet another flavor that perhaps was built for the very high bands. And I think that, as Brian said, the sharing is going to be different in the mid-band spectrum than it is in the millimeter wave bands, but we ought to be pursuing it in both places.
Thanks, Ruth. Let me turn to Mark. And I guess, so this panel is a little bit about the future, and I probably would be derelict if we didn't ask something about way down the road. And I know this is like trying to predict the weather next year, but you do hear from the, I'll call them futurists, and even more than futurists. We hear people talk about injecting artificial intelligence and machine learning into spectrum management and spectrum policy. Based upon your practical experience with CBRS, where do you think AI machine learning would fit? And what would these kinds of things, I mean, I think the US is kind of on the forefront here. What would those things mean for US competitiveness?
That's a great question. You know, I'd say that it's not really science fiction, you know, and I wouldn't say it's that far in the future. If you get any sort of IEEE magazines that deal with communications or vehicular technology or any of that, you know, and sort of channel your inner geek, you can prognosticate this, you know, not into the far distant future. You know, one key aspect of AI and machine learning is data. And right now, there's data all over the place. And so the key aspect of this is making sense out of it. You know, right now with this, you know, the database-centric spectrum sharing enabled or spectrum enabling systems, we're really just using a couple of sets of data. You know, data right now, the data we're using for SAS is really just data that's out of the Commission's licensing systems. And then other information is fed in either through the ESC or hopefully ultimately the IIC or some other portal type aspect. And that's really perfunctory. Moving us into the realm of something that can be a lot more dynamic and be able to provide more precision on spectrum grants, let's say, would take data from disparate sources that we may not be thinking about as telecom engineers or telecom policymakers. It could just simply be, you know, personal usage statistics related to COVID, for example, which is sort of low-hanging fruit. But, you know, we saw a lot of shifts in that, mostly, you know, I mentioned this when I spoke earlier, in building, you know, generally in building wasn't being done a lot. So that sort of suppressed some of the in-building deployments. But think about now the operations in a home. And what can we do in spectrum management using AI to target more spectrum usage there? Or a lot of folks, you know, during the early stages of COVID were presenting at hospitals. And a lot of hospitals were left with a lot of issues on how they could better triage without exposing the entire hospital to a lot of people with a highly infectious disease. So a lot of the hospitals put triage centers away from the building and backhauled information back into the hospital. And a lot of that was using, or some of that was using CBRS. So taking the data associated with actually, you know, use cases that we have and then marrying that with spectrum usage, that's really, I think, the key in unlocking sort of my inner geek on you know, making spectrum more available across the entire ecosystem. And you know, it's not really that far out there. Like I said, a lot of this is a lot of papers being written by again, my own geeky people in IEEE and other magazines. The key is taking that from that concept to reality. One really cool conference that's happening is the Dynamic Spectrum conference that DICE band that IEEE has, which takes a lot of those geeky concepts down a little bit closer to the level of reality. And actually, they're talking about DICE band here in, I think, in December timeframe. And they're seeking papers. And a lot of the papers they're looking for are trying to make things more real using these concepts that are available. I think Brian mentioned it, mobile edge computing. moving a lot more stuff to the edge of the network using cloud-based technologies, so you don't have latency in backhauling information. So think about what that might mean in terms of the spectrum and the spectrum sharing systems. Right now, CBRS, SAS, and even the AFC are all centralized. So you've got a all the device has to do is send information to this centralized location, and then the centralized location has to send information back. What if we put all those smarts on the device, and only thing going back and forth was data, and it wasn't that frequent? And the device had a lot more capability to know its local environment. Then the device can make a lot more decisions on its own that are a lot more based on the local information, and could be including clutter, which is trees and whatnot, building information, and even data or methodologies to extract operational information from data that's GPS based. So I think we're really on the precipice as we move into, hopefully actually with AFC. There's a lot of interesting discussions happening in the bowels, if you will, of these AFC discussions. They might be able to move this into another realm. But Ruth made a good point that she said, attributed to me, was one of the things we need to do is make sure that these things are doable and that there's some consistency. AFC is very different from CBRS, but not that different from TV Whitespace. So having some consistency in the policy and rulemaking, actually, I think will help people like us and others that are building these things put something together that is cutting edge, but that's doable and not a whole leap of technical faith as we get into that. So back to you.
Terrific, thanks, Mark. So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience here. So I'm gonna, Will, if you don't mind, I'm actually gonna funnel one of those to you. And so just so that I don't mess it up paraphrasing, I'm just gonna read it for Will. When discussing how Verizon's optimizing, you mentioned you're using network sharing and virtualization. Can you explain what you mean when you say virtualization and how that optimizes the resource?
Well, I think a piece of it is that, again, when we use the different tools, whether it's virtualization, the slicing, what have you, that it lets us do a lot of different things with the network at once, and it lets us build that network efficiently and make sure that, again, we're getting as much as we possibly can out of the spectrum, right? So at this point, that's what we're moving very quickly towards, sort of a virtualized RAN approach. Where there will be those opportunities, again, for efficient deployment and making sure you're just getting everything you can. And, again, with the technologies like the slicing, if you have multiple different use cases, some that need, if we're doing something, to Vic's point for NASA that needs very high reliability, then we can create a slice that maintains that while you're still using the rest of the spectrum for things that may have different demands. So we're very excited about that. And I will say, just to pivot slightly, that I do think that for all the talk we've had here about sharing, and we're supportive of network sharing. We know that there's no easy spectrum left to sort of pick out of the air, and so we're I think the largest purchaser of CBRS last year. So we're not in any way negative on sharing, but I did want to reiterate that in our view, the flexible exclusive use licensing really is still the gold standard. That's really been sort of the lifeblood of getting us where we are as an industry. And, there's lots of reasons for that. It lets you have a lot more predictability. It takes away some of the complexity. And it does let you roll in new technologies as they become available, like virtualization, et cetera, so that you can transition from one technology to another and get the most out of the spectrum as you're doing it. So again, we're not negative on sharing, and we think there is an important reason to continue to do research and improve the sharing capabilities, but don't want to lose sight of how important exclusive use, flexible licensing really has been to us and the rest of the industry until now.
Terrific, Will. So I've got another question from the audience. I'm going to send this one to Vic, and it's tagging on to Will's comment about the importance of flexible exclusive use. The question from the audience, Vic, was geared toward DoD, but I'm going to selfishly funnel it to NASA and maybe DoD by extension. But so the question is, how do you envision the government and industry establishing parameters for progress on 5G? And I think what they mean by the question is, well, they say is like both tactical, private, and commercial use. What needs to be done next to to make, as Will was saying, to make government kind of a client, a customer of Verizon's 5G operations?
So let me see if I can answer that in two parts. I would say one, we're already a customer of 5G, but I think there needs to be, and we try to do it through the current process, the current regulatory bifurcated process. And for some reason, we're missing each other on the technical level. I think our models are accurate. Your models are accurate. Where we fall short is, or where we fail short is assumptions going in. So if you got bad data going in, even if your math is correct, your product is going to be incorrect. You're going to disagree. You're going to disagree in domestic and international form. So what we're saying is let's address it on the front end collectively. You know, the models are accurate. Let's agree on how you characterize your networks, how we characterize our systems. Collectively do the analysis, and by definition, we should come out with the same answer on one, your understanding of our systems and how we operate, and two, agree or disagree and adjust how we need to be protected. So to that effect, we said we need to be more proactive this cycle. We NASA, we can control what we do. And we're teeing up a workshop. You'll be seeing something from us very soon. We're taking the lead where we're going to have government, we're going to have industry, we're going to have our space partners. And hopefully we can come out with not only technical methods and processes to go forward, but establishments of long-term relationships where it's not us versus them. You know, I can kind of speak for you. It's not federal versus industry, or it shouldn't be, even though, you know, we have our regulatory process structured the way it is. It should be ongoing collaborative discussions which come to a common means. And like I said earlier, science is a national interest. Space exploration is a national interest. Industry, private, 5G is a national interest, the economy. So we're all collectively working common national interests. It's just that I think there's some improvement on the technical and communication and collaboration. Like I said, very, very, very near, it's in process, a workshop. Hopefully we can make it as public as possible, but we want to make it cross-cutting. And I think that's a big step to moving forward with your interests and our interests.
Thank you, Vic. We're about out of time. I'm going to ask one simple question. I'm going to let Brian take it here. So, Brian, next year's panel, when someone's here next year, are they going to be talking more about 6G or 5G? Which one?
Both. I don't know. Hopefully 6G.
Very good. All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists. I appreciate these excellent answers, and what a credit to the industry and to government to have these the brain trust, if you will, up here. I appreciate it. Thanks for all you're doing. And I guess I'll hand it over to Charles.
Thank you, Scott. Another lively panel discussion there in the hopper. It's always fun hearing from Vic with certainly the fascinating federal missions that we do on the federal side, including preparing for the upcoming lunar missions. And then on the industry side, with hearing with Starry, with Brian about all the millimeter wave and the high gigaband, and gigabit throughputs that they're using here, especially using the beam steering and innovative antenna technologies. Ruth, really looking forward to getting into the paper, taking stock of spectrum sharing, especially on the bidirectional side. I think that's interesting concepts that we look forward to getting more information on. And then, of course, with Verizon and Will and the 5G, and it's more than just faster downloads. There are also some exciting use cases coming. And then kind of wrapping up with the core on the spectrum management side with Mark, regarding CBRS and the 6 gigahertz AFC and the other spectrum sharing technologies, and sharing with us a very, very detailed analysis of that. It's very much appreciated. So that takes care of panel 2 for us. We're going to take a break here. So for those of us on the East Coast, we have an opportunity to get a bite to eat. We'll be starting promptly at 12:30 Eastern with remarks from Congressman Doyle. Thank you very much. See you then.